Welcome to the Union League of Philadelphia, which is FPRI's home away from home. We're very pleased to say that, by the way. My name's Ed Terzansky. I'm the John Templeton Fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and also Vice President for membership here at the Union League of Philadelphia. And I have to say, what a great pleasure it is to welcome you and another FPRI program here to the Union League. Every time I have the privilege of doing this, I can't help but think of Harvey Sickerman, who of blessed memory not only helped propel FPRI to new heights, but also was a very esteemed and cherished member here at the League. And in welcoming you, the first thoughts that occur is that the Union League and FPRI share certain core beliefs that would probably best be described as an ethos. We have a deep and abiding respect for the imprint of geography and human nature on those events that wind up being presented as history. And we believe that history provides lessons that explain the present and in many respects wind up predicting the future. So for those who paid attention to the presidential election 4 years ago, you know there was a question about whether Russia and her imprint on the world was an artifact of the foreign policy of the 1980s, or whether it had some relevance to the present. Well, it turns out that past is prologue, and we're very pleased here at the Union League to host another outstanding program by the Foreign Policy Research Institute that looks at some of the most important questions having to do with how the Soviet Union went away and how we find ourselves in this present situation vis-a-vis Russia. So with that, I thank you, I welcome you, and we wish you a very good day.
So I'm going to be very brief since I'll be chairing one of the panels in the afternoon. I'll not say anything substantive. But I do want to thank Ed Terzansky for his very warm welcome and for enabling us to be in such a lovely and historic location for this conference or symposium. And I want to also mention that we started the planning for this conference more than a little over a year ago, at the beginning of the program that we were just about to launch. This Eurasia program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute is only 1 year old. We envisioned this as the 1 year celebrating or marking the first anniversary of our program. But we never would have imagined how extraordinarily timely the topic would have become at the time of this conference. Prescience, I will not claim, but we're absolutely delighted to have you all here to discuss these extremely important issues. I want to recognize, before I turn it over to John Haynes, my co-director, the co-director of the Eurasia program, Ambassador James Collins is already here with us. If you'll stand, Jim, so they'll know you at the intersection, at the intermissions, etc. Our keynote speaker. Since there's very much to talk about this afternoon, we want to launch quickly into the substance. Without further ado, let me turn over the microphone to my esteemed and distinguished colleague and fellow director of the FPRI Eurasia program, John Haynes.
Well, thank you. Nobody noticed the head snap when you said without further ado, because I was still thinking about my comments. So thank you, Adrian. I'm also pleased to be back at the Union League. My experience here is a bit different. I was married here some years ago. So one of the things I learned in the intervening period is to take direction. So part of my direction today is to keep it very brief, Maya's direction is we want to move on to the panels. I'd first like to thank Maya Tarashvili, our colleague at the Eurasia Center, who has done much of the heavy lifting over the last 2 years and has organized the conference today. So if we could just please thank Maya. Our other colleague, Chris Miller, you'll meet in a moment. Chris is moderating and will have a significant role today. Ed mentioned history. History, of course, is always a subject at the Union League. Reminded of the character Alec Lemus in one of Spy Who Came In From the Cold, asking the question, what do you believe in? And the answer was, I believe in history. So I will not claim that I believe in history, but I believe in the study of history and appreciation of the lessons of history. Hopefully today we will come away better versed in that. Our subject is 25 years since the fall of the USSR, where is Eurasia headed? We have two panels. Our first panel is on energy politics of the Eurasia region. Our moderator is Chris Miller, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris to introduce the panel. So again, thank you for coming, and look forward to today.
You can come right now. Well, welcome everyone again. My name is Chris Miller. I'm a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where I work with the Eurasia program, as John previously mentioned. Today we have two panels set out. The first panel right now is on energy politics in the Eurasia region. We have four very distinguished speakers to discuss this subject today. Their bios are listed in full in your program, so to make sure we have enough time for discussion, I won't read to you their very kind of extensive list of accomplishments. But just as a brief introduction, we have Steve Kopitz, Anna Mikulska, Dan Kellerman, and John Haynes. We'll begin with comments from each of our panelists, and then towards the end of our time on this panel, open it up to questions from you, from the audience. And I will say in advance, if you have a question, we would welcome that. If you have a comment, maybe you could save a comment for the coffee period afterwards. But questions we strongly encourage. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephen for our first comment.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'll use the podium because I'm accustomed to speaking standing up. Actually, I'm accustomed to speaking with slides, but today I'm going to use text. I'd also add that I just got new glasses and they're not progressive, so we'll see how it goes. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute for the invitation and the Union League for hosting this. It's really fabulous to be here. It's just an incredible institution, and I'm very honored and gratified to be here. As Chris mentioned, my name is Stephen Kopitz. I run a consultancy that focuses on macro oil markets, and we track oil runs the spectrum from very granular things like proppant in shale fracking, but all the way up to geopolitical items like Russia, China, and Iran. So I cover a bit of foreign policy in our practice as well. I also lived much of this period since the transition in Eastern Europe. From 1990 to 2005, I lived in Budapest, so I got a chance to see the transition very much firsthand. I don't know the Soviet Union very well, but I do know Eastern Europe really well. Okay, so what should I say has changed after 25 years? Has very much changed at all. So I think the first thing we can say is that communism is still dead. It ended in 1990, and it has really not resurfaced as a coherent ideology, save in Venezuela and, of course, Cuba and North Korea. But elsewhere in Eastern Europe, we can say now that the communist period is over with all the changes that wrought. And yet, one of the things that I see is that the scars of communism remain. Democracy ultimately depends upon free men and women to claim ownership of society and to believe that government is to act in the citizens' interests. Communism, as I can see in Hungary, destroyed this confidence. So it took an honest and free people, I would say before the war, and converted them into very much dependents, afraid of the future and afraid for their society. What has happened in Hungary, as has happened in Poland, in China, and also in Russia, is that many people have turned now to strong men to provide them security against the uncertainties of the future and as a bulwark against changing events over time. This is true no less for Russia, of course, than it is for for Hungary. These political developments set the background for oil and gas markets, which I will be talking about today. Business ultimately drives politics, but energy does matter, and it plays a central role in the former Soviet Union states, in particular in Russia. Russia is one of the 3 biggest producers of oil in the world. It is the 2nd largest exporter of oil after Saudi Arabia. Russia is also the world's largest exporter of natural gas by a margin, principally to Western Europe, to Europe, and it provides 35% of European needs. As a result, Russia earns vast sum in export revenues, and this has really helped the Russian economy over the last 25 years. As late as 2000, oil and gas revenues provided more than 20% of Russian GDP, and even more if we consider it in ruble terms. From 2011 to 2013, that is the high oil price period succeeding the recession, Russia saw annual oil and gas export revenues around $350 billion per year, on GDP around $2 trillion a year. So that's a lot of extra cash. The resulting surplus caused the ruble to revalue in real terms. That is, domestic Russian inflation, which has averaged around 10% a year, was not showing up in ruble devaluation. Okay? With high oil prices and a strong ruble, Russia's consumers could rightly feel that life was getting better. This bolstered Putin's popularity, and it also provided him the money for foreign adventurism. In August 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. Unfortunately for Putin, the oil price crashed at the same time, and oil prices have fallen by more than half since then. In 2016, they were 60% below their 2013 levels. Natural gas prices have also fallen from a high of nearly $11 a cubic foot in 2012 to less than $5 last year. As a consequence, Russia's oil and gas revenues in dollar terms have fallen by more than 60%, from $350 billion to $125 billion. Falling oil prices, and even more the sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, crushed Russia's GDP in dollar terms, which is down 43% since 2014. The ruble has also collapsed, devaluing by half since the imposition of sanctions on China. The low point for commodity prices is almost certainly behind us, but we may not see expensive oil and gas for some time. Therefore, Russia's position may remain compromised for some time to come. The collapse of oil and gas prices was all due to U.S. shale. The rapid growth of U.S. shale oil production, particularly in 2014, broke the back of the OPEC cartel and forced OPEC to start pumping oil in earnest, leading to an implosion of global oil prices. Shale gas, in the form of LNG, liquefied natural gas exports, is increasingly setting the marginal price in Europe at $3.50 for a cubic foot, which is the price of natural gas wholesale in the U.S. today. The landed price in New York translates into $5 after it's liquefied, transported, and regasified. Given that the U.S. has plenty of shale gas, it's unlikely natural gas prices will see $11 a cubic foot in Europe for a long time to come. As a consequence, Russia has been robbed of its financial ammunition. It is out of dry powder, and this situation may not materially improve for some time. Where do we go from here? As we look forward, I think most of us would agree that the wild card today is not Russia, but the incoming policies of the Trump administration. Will Russia and the U.S. become friendly? The Trump administration would like that, but from my perspective, it's hard to see. So Russia is in a bind. Our analysis suggests that the Ukraine invasion and resulting sanctions are reducing Russian GDP growth by more than 1 percentage point per year. By 2020, the country's GDP will be $250 billion less that year than it would have been otherwise. Indeed, the cumulative cost in foregone GDP growth is likely to total more than $1 trillion by 2020 if I add up every year's increment. And this on Russian GDP forecast to be $1.7 trillion in 2020. So the cost of Ukrainian adventurism for Russia in foregone economic growth is formidable indeed based upon our analysis. So, on the face of it, Russia needs a deal. The time has come for the Russians to consider whether they want to consider this path or try something new with the Trump administration. I think I will leave it there for now. I think that opens up some questions and leaving us plenty to discuss. Thank you.
Good afternoon. afternoon. Thank you so much for FPRI for having me here, and of course Union League of Philadelphia. It's my honor to be here, and hopefully I can shine some light on the issues that nowadays pertain at the Russian, Ukrainian, and Russian generally relations in the Black Sea region. My name is Anna Mikulska. I'm Polish, so I have a little bit of an insight into the Eastern Europe. I am also a non-resident fellow for the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies. And one thing that I need to kind of note is that the relations between Russia and the West are the worst they have been since the end of the Soviet era. And much of the strain is related to geopolitical situation in the Black Sea region and around that region. More specifically to the Russian annexation of the Crimea and its aggression against Ukraine. And this geopolitical situation has a very strong energy dimension. And the fact is that even though the crisis is not really an energy crisis, because those issues run much deeper than natural gas or oil, the energy dimensions is pertaining and extremely important to how the countries will act going forward. Russia has historically used its energy policy either being a resource supplier or a country of demand to exert pressure on other countries, and this includes also its pressure on Ukraine, allowing the country to use very low prices of natural gas in exchange for its access to Crimea and specifically to its naval base at Sevastopol. When Russia saw Ukraine getting dangerously close to NATO, it decided that it needs to act, and one way to do that was annexing Crimea. It's also worth noting that annexation of Crimea has a dimension in energy, as there has been very recent discovery of natural gas and oil offshore Crimea in 2012, with Ukraine actually putting approximately $10 billion already into development of those resources. So now they are with Russia, and there is going to be, we will still have to see how Russia will act upon those. Several issues make the Russia-Ukraine debacle important for other countries, and especially for Europe. First, Stephen already noticed, Russia has been the largest natural gas provider for the European Union. It also, over 2/3 of Russian gas destined for Europe moved through Ukraine. Now it's less, approximately half of that gas, but still a very, very big number. And the dependence is particularly strong among Central and Eastern European countries. So this is a matter of Soviet-era legacy, but it also presents a very strong transit country risks in recent years. And we've seen pricing disputes, debt settlement issues, and politics that have all clouded security of supply for European countries. And ensuring this security will take diversification of natural gas supplies. There are two trends in Europe that we see with respect to what should be done or what can be done. And the first is diversification of supply away from Russia. And that would be done via LNG, possibly hydraulic fracturing, or bringing or piping gas from other countries, specifically from Azerbaijan. Also, the other trend would be diversification of supply away from Ukraine transit, which basically leaves Russia as the supplier of natural gas, but changes the routes where the natural gas is going. And that would be through now Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, which is already approved, as well as South Stream that would go via Turkey straight from Russia to Europe. It's very worth noting that there is a strong disagreement between the Eastern European and Western European countries on which route should Europe take, with the Eastern Europe and Central Europe being strongly opposed to keep Russian supplies at the same level, just via different routes. And that goes back to their experiences and the baggage, the historical baggage, and that those countries have with regards to relationships with Russia. Now, of course, it should not be a surprise that Russia prefers the Western European position, and that goes back to what already Stephen was also saying, how much revenues the country actually gets from exporting natural gas to Europe. The exports are not as important, nor they bring as much money as oil exports, but they are a sizable amount, and Russia is definitely making sure that they will stay in the game. That being said, Russia also recognizes that its dealings with Europe, as well as Ukraine as a transit country, have important implications for reputation that Russia has, and specifically as Russia is eyeing a new market, China, for the supplies of natural gas. So it's not really that Russia has the upper hand. Nowadays, with the abundance of generally energy supplies that we see around the world, producing countries have to make sure that their reputation is also so that other countries like China, specifically, and other Asian countries are willing to deal with them. And the two options that Europe is recognizing now as viable, going either with other than Russian natural gas or for different routes, kind of going around the Ukraine, also point to Turkey as a very important country, since both of these options include Turkey as a transit route. So for South Stream that Russia is planning, it's planning to go to basically pipe its natural gas via Turkey, and the same goes for Azerbaijani gas, which would go through TANAP and all the way to Europe. So Turkey has this also now geopolitical situation where, depending on what chooses, or depending on which of these plans will end up realizing, it might find itself in a very different environment. And if it only will end up relying on Russian gas, it might actually be in a position similar to Ukraine, where it depends on Russia for natural gas, which approximately 60% of its gas come from Russia already. But if it ends up also being host to other pipelines like TANAP, it actually can have a very strong geopolitical location, serve as a hub for European natural gas. So there are profound changes that now we see in the Black Sea region that are gonna be coming up and in quite near future. And on top of this, Turkey is trying to also accommodate LNG, the new game in town, and that makes natural gas much easier to deal with and much more global than it used to be. And kind of to finish my talk here about it, the reason why I've been possibly I should have said that at the beginning. The reason I've been talking about natural gas mostly, it is because until now, and still to a great extent, it's much more regional resource than oil is. Oil is traded internationally, it's much more fungible, but however, natural gas, since it's much more costly and much more to transport it, and much more territorial. Natural gas is much more territorially based. It is really what will be driving the geopolitics of Black Sea region, Russia versus Ukraine versus Central and Eastern Europe going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Dan?
All right, I think I'll just speak from here if that's all right. So I'm going to talk about the EU angle on these issues, and maybe to just say one word about my own background. I too spent some time living in Hungary back in the early 90s, but then when I and was fascinated by the process of transition and democratization there, and then over time I thought, well, these guys want to join the EU, and I should learn something about the European Union. And that dragged me in over many years of study into becoming an expert on the EU. And it's only very recently with some of the heightened tensions between the EU and some of its member states in the East that I've kind of been brought back to looking at Eastern Europe. And I'll get to that at the end of my talk and some of the tensions and issues like energy with Hungary. But to focus on the sort of EU or Brussels angles of this, what I want to talk about is the current plans to create a European energy union. I want to start by giving you a bit of background context for that. Then I want to talk about sort of the contemporary politics, the upcoming elections in Europe this year, how they might affect European position on energy union, and then sort of conclude by looking forward where this is likely to go. So, with regard to the background, it's worth noting, right, that the EU began with energy, right? It was the European Coal and Steel Community. If we go back to the early 50s, that was at the core of the foundations of the European community, was trying to integrate at least one energy sector, and then they went on to do atomic energy through Euratom. So there's been these efforts from the very beginning, over 6 decades, and yet the effort, like so many efforts of the EU to complete this energy union is still incomplete, right? So while they're just trying to roll out a new energy union, in a sense, they've been working on this for decades. So to just say something about that, background, there have been over the years hundreds, literally, as of 2010, someone tabulated them all. There had been 350 different legal instruments, directives, regulations on different aspects of energy policy. But then it's really accelerated since 2009. Okay, since the Lisbon Treaty, and the EU got some new competences in this area. And so in 2009, we saw something called the Third Energy Package, which really sort of set out the new 3 pillars of what the EU's focus was going to be in energy: security of supply, right? Sustainability, or in other words, they were going to link their energy policy to their climate change policy, where they're trying to set themselves out as a world leader, and then competitiveness, because frankly, Europeans were paying too much for energy, and they saw that it was hurting their industrial competitiveness. So they set those out, and they, in this Third Energy Package in 2009, they tried to do a push forward with new legal instruments to try to integrate the energy market. But it's important to note that was partly motivated by experiences in 2006 and 2009 with Ukraine, where they saw supply disruptions and made them feel more vulnerable, right? So anyway, that's the background up till 2009. And then you might ask, well, what's so hard? Why haven't they been able to integrate the market in energy the way they've been able to integrate other aspects of the common market, right, more successfully? And I mean, there's many factors, but I would just highlight a couple things that are enduring and that are still in play today. I mean, a true single market in energy would mean many things, right? Some of the impediments are about infrastructure, et cetera, and the grids, and the ability to move things across Europe between markets. But also, a true single market could mean, at least this is Donald Tusk's vision, it would mean basically joint purchasing of energy for the union from outside suppliers, right? And for some countries that sounds great, joint purchasing, right? But joint purchasing also would mean a kind of common price, right? And that would be good for some, but it wouldn't be good for all necessarily, because for some countries they fear. There's 2 sort of separate sets of fears. One set of fears is that it could for them mean higher prices, because maybe they've gotten a sweetheart deal from the Russians for geopolitical reasons, something like that, or some states have other domestic supplies that, let's say French nuclear or whatever, that historically made their prices lower. So even on that basic issue, there's fundamental disagreements, and a lot of it really boils down to differences in the mixture of the energy supply in different countries, where we have a wide variety from those who are dependent on Russian gas, some still using coal, others LNG, France nuclear, et cetera. So that's made it very hard for the member states to come together and really agree on the most sort of decisive steps they'd need toward energy union. All right, so then comes 2014, this Tusk proposal for an energy union. And that was done right in the context of the mounting tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and then the annexation of Crimea. And sort of in response to that, right, the very month that Crimea was annexed is when Tusk comes forward with this proposal for an energy union with joint purchasing. That's in 2014, of course, as he was saying. The next year, the Commission pushes forward with this package to take up Tusk's ideas, although they toned down some of what he wanted. But so now the EU has agreed on this energy union package, and they're rolling out different measures and funding packages to, with basically 5 goals: to increase energy security, to create a fully integrated energy market, increasing efficiency, and then the climate goals, decarbonization, et cetera. While they're trying to do all that, all those impediments and the tensions between member states that I mentioned are still there. And then there's an added angle, I think, which is really come into play, that Russia is not taking this lying down, right? And as Mitch Ornstein is going to be on the panel later, and I have written together, they're trying to cultivate sort of Trojan horse governments within the EU, both in the foreign policy arena to undermine unity on sanctions, right? But also in the energy arena, right? So when they do this nuclear deal with Hungary for the PAX-2 reactor, et cetera, what they're trying to do is divide Europe on energy. They recognize the different material interests that countries have and different sort of geostrategic positions, and they're trying to cultivate that to divide energy unions. So it's certainly not sure that it will succeed. All right, and if I have 2 minutes left, right, I'll just add a couple things about the contemporary politics right now this year and where this may look going forward. So I was asked to comment on how the elections in France and Germany this year might affect the picture of energy policy in Eurasia and Europe. And I would just say, clearly Le Pen would be a disaster for more reasons than I have time to enumerate in this respect. But we know that she's been directly backed by Putin, her party, the National Front, being financed by a Russian bank close to him. Fillon, who is the center-right candidate, who until a couple days ago looked like he had very good prospects, but he's in some scandals. He's also a big Russophile and would quite possibly take positions that might work to undermine some of the energy union. But we don't know who will win. And Macron, who's the socialist candidate, won't win in any case, but there's this independent Macron who's surging, and he is a huge proponent of European integration and would certainly back a strong energy union. In Germany, I think the main options that we can see are either Merkel returning, which will be a continuity of policy, that's still most likely, or now it's also possible we would see a Social Democrat Green coalition, and now the Social Democratic candidate Martin Schulz is the former leader of Social Democrats and president of the European Parliament, and he's a huge backer of common energy policy, unlike some German Social Democrats. And so I think we would see a German government led by him, again, backing energy union. So just to conclude then, where is this all heading? I think I'd just like to end with a sort of a metaphor that I've used in understanding how the EU develops. I think the EU often advances through a process I call failing forward, right? Where policies, and you see this, of course, with the euro, right? You have a half-built eurozone with all these missing institutions. It proves a failure. Then you have the states say, well, we don't want to really get rid of it, so let's have a crisis meeting and see what we need to fix. Same thing on the Schengen area, et cetera. And I think energy union will be like that too. It will show its weaknesses and failures, but the EU will respond not by sort of scrapping it, but by failing forward gradually and incrementally. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. John.
This is more of a transparent effort to separate myself from the timekeeper, so I will, however, try to keep it brief. As soon as I get myself squared away, here we go. So it's a truism that Russia's vast energy resources are a source of economic strength and a tool of coercive diplomacy. Russian investments in energy infrastructure and control of energy sources allows Moscow to manipulate energy for political gain. While unwelcome, such oligopolistic behavior is not especially surprising. The effect of using the energy weapon is paradoxical, however, in that it can stoke anxiety and drive countries to seek protection from Russian pressure. As the authors of a 2015 NATO research paper wrote, the Ukraine crisis offers some important energy security lessons. When it comes to energy, geography is still destiny. Pipelines still mean economic and political power. The paper's authors characterize energy as a tool of hybrid warfare. That may be overcooked, however. It's disputable whether energy policy has a place in hybrid warfare, which in any event is an overused and misunderstood trope. They wrote, to destabilize Ukraine, Russia managed to integrate energy into its strategy by the expropriation of Ukrainian energy assets and pressure on gas prices. Hence, they concluded if NATO wants to be serious about countering hybrid threats, it must include energy in the equation. I'm not sure what the hybrid label adds to our understanding of events. The term references Gerasimov's notion of nonlinear warfare. General Gerasimov, however, took care to use linear or nonlinear, or if you will, hybrid, solely as a descriptor of the operating environment and not as a novel military doctrine or way of war. In eastern Ukraine, energy is part of the operating environment just as it was in earlier conflicts. OPEC leveraged energy supplies during the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and the United States destroyed North Vietnam's energy infrastructure when it bombed offloading and storage facilities around Haiphong Harbor. Neither can be described fairly as hybrid, and calling them such adds nothing to our understanding. If energy is indeed weaponized, it's strictly in the context of the operating environment. Let me suggest two ways this might occur. The first is the systematic use of energy supplies to extract political or economic concessions outside normal trade operations. For example, when the Bush administration proposed to base a mid-course missile tracking and discrimination system at Beatty, Russia threatened to cut off gas exports to the Czech Republic and deploy Russian medium-range defensive missiles in Kaliningrad. The second way is to systematically leverage energy infrastructure. Some efforts are obvious, like redirecting energy flows to exert political and economic pressure. Almost 80% of Russian gas to Europe transited Ukraine before Nord Stream 1 went into service in 2011. When it did, Ukraine immediately lost valuable transit fee revenue, and that is something that the Gazprom-backed Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream pipelines would worsen. Nord Stream 2 would cost Ukraine $2 billion a year in lost transit fees and would cost Slovakia $1 billion. It's no wonder United States Special Envoy Amos Hochstein said Nord Stream 2 would collapse Ukraine's economy. Turkish Stream would likewise impose punishing revenue losses on Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, and Bulgaria by circumventing existing trans-Balkan routes. The question begged here is this: are pipelines like Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream commercial projects that strengthen European energy security, or are they geopolitical ones that undermine European energy security? Distribution pipelines are a less obvious lever and can work in a couple of ways. One is to control a country's distribution grid, as in Moldova, where Gazprom owns half of Moldova Gas. Moldovan-type direct control is thankfully not possible within the European Union, however, with the third energy package prohibits energy suppliers from gaining possession of distribution networks. In Bulgaria, however, didn't stop Russia from using distribution instrumentally to leverage political concessions. What Russia recognized was that the third energy package also safeguarded distribution companies from discrimination by state-owned enterprises. Russia used a company called Overgas as a Bulgarian proxy for Russian state interests. Gazprom ended the state-owned company's supply monopoly and began diverting gas to Overgas, in which Gazprom also owned a stake. 2 years hence, when Russian geopolitical interests changed, Gazprom abruptly reversed course and cut off Overgas. Gazprom's former partner reportedly told the European Union he suspected the alignment of interests between Gazprom and Bulgargas is politically motivated by Russia's desire to reanimate the South Stream project in light of current tensions between Russia and Turkey. President Putin had earlier canceled South Stream and replaced it with Turkish Stream to supply gas directly to Turkey, with which Russia was at that time at odds. A former Bulgarian ambassador to Moscow called Russia's actions a hybrid event, there's a word again, against Overgas, the goal of which was to remove a key asset in exchange for upcoming favors. So far, our discussion has focused on physical infrastructure. Let's turn to Russian efforts to squelch new energy supply sources, something which connects us to the conflict in eastern Ukraine and in a less obvious way to the recent presidential election here. Eastern Ukraine's Donbas region is rich in energy infrastructure and resources. Its massive shale gas deposit holds an estimated 4 trillion cubic meters of shale gas, about a third of Ukraine's total shale gas reserve, which is Europe's third or fourth largest, depending on which estimate one uses. Russia has a determined policy to block the exploitation of shale gas reserves in Central and Eastern Europe, using force when it must and politics when it can. The public version of the recent report on Russian interference in the American presidential election said this: RT runs anti-fracking programming highlighting environmental issues and impacts on public health. This is likely reflective of the Russian government's concern over the impact of fracking and U.S. natural gas production on the global energy market and the potential challenges to Gazprom's profitability. Now, I depart from the DNI's conclusions about the effectiveness of RT America, which in the most recent Nielsen numbers failed to hit the top 100 channels. That means RT America had fewer viewers than the 48,000 who watched VH1 Classics. And there hasn't been an outbreak of 80s mullets or 90s parachute pants, so we have to think that that audience is fairly limited. However, while one might find RT America ineffectual, the same cannot be said of Russian agitprop in Central and Eastern Europe. A sophisticated understanding of the American anti-fracking movement informs the activities of Russian security services, the institutional memory of which extends to running disarmament campaigns in Europe and using front groups as national mobilizing forces from the 1950s through at least the 1990s. In 2014, NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen had this to say: Russia, as part of their sophisticated information and disinformation operations, engage actively with so-called non-government organizations, environmental organizations working against shale gas, obviously to maintain European dependence on imported Russian gas. Rasmussen warned that Russia was secretly funding environmental groups to hinder fracking and preserve dependence on Russian energy. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said much the same in a June 2014 speech in Edmonton, in which she railed against what she called phony environmental groups supported by Russian money. We saw well-organized and well-funded environmental opposition spring up suddenly in countries like Bulgaria and Ukraine, which heretofore showed little concern for environmentalism. In Romania, there were persistent allegations that Gazprom fomented anti-fracking activities in northern Dobruja, where Chevron held the mineral rights, and those activities were absent from western Romania, where Gazprom held them. Across the border, Bulgaria sits atop one of Eurasia's largest known shale gas reserves, a seeming economic boom for a country that imports almost all of its gas. So it seems inexplicable that Bulgaria imposed an indefinite ban on hydraulic fracking in January 2012. Earlier, a Russian state-owned company called Rosgeo declared its interest in shale gas exploration in Bulgaria. It at the time was linked to Overgas, which we mentioned before, which had earlier won expansive exploration rights in January 2010, 2 years before Bulgaria's fracking moratorium took effect. Let me wrap up by pointing to two situations at polar ends of the Eurasian axis that merit attention in 2017. That axis is the imaginary geographic line extending south from the Russian Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad to Armenia in the South Caucasus. Several days ago, the editors of Regnum took the unusual step of criticizing Russian leaders for exposing Kaliningrad to the threat of an energy blockade. The incident said to prompt the criticism, an aircraft sliding off a runway and causing a lengthy airport closure, is less important than the larger point. It is that, quote, central authorities still do not have a comprehensive roadmap for the non-military security of the Russian Baltic region, which Regnum elaborated as energy security, transportation security, and information security. Kaliningrad's energy supply comes almost entirely from a gas pipeline that runs through Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania, supplemented by small quantities of coal shipped by rail through Lithuania or by sea routes controlled by Poland. As to our interest here today, the Regnum editors wrote that Mr. Putin has declared nuclear power to be foundational to solving the challenges of energy security in the Kaliningrad region. They concluded this will make the region virtually immune from the very real possibility of energy blackmail by NATO and the EU as a whole, and by Poland and Lithuania in particular. The Regnum editors condemned local officials for capitulating to what it described colorfully as German expansionism in the hope that the German suitor will be merciful instead of demanding unconditional surrender by the Russian bride, who in any event has already changed her name to the Prussian one, Königsberg. In June, TASS and several other Russian news portals reported that Rosatom had reached agreement with unnamed large European energy holdings to export electricity from Kaliningrad's unfinished Baltic nuclear power plant. Construction on that plant was halted in 2014 when Lithuania withdrew from the unified energy system with Russia. The Lithuanian foreign minister said just a few days ago that Lithuania will absolutely refuse to buy electric power produced by the Baltic nuclear power plant and another one now under construction in Belarus. The question remains whether the Kaliningrad grid will be isolated, something which led Rosatom to engage a Latvian firm to study. The recent exceedance of Rosatom's Sergei Kiryenkov and matters like Rosatom's role in Hungary's Paks nuclear power plant bear further consideration here today. Moving to the southern end of the Eurasian axis, Russia used its playbook from the European borderlands and took control of Armenia's domestic energy infrastructure a decade ago through a series of property for debt swaps. Among other effects, it gives Russia a de facto veto over Armenian access to gas from neighboring Iran. In September 2005, the Armenian government acceded to the sale of its national power grid by a British company to a subsidiary of the Russian government-owned Federal Grid Company. A year later, a joint Armenian-Russian firm known as Rosasprom seized control of the Armenian portion of the Tabriz-Yersak gas pipeline that runs between Iran and southern Armenia. In January 2014, that company was absorbed into Gazprom proper. The pipeline's capacity is twice Armenia's annual consumption, yet with no control over its domestic energy infrastructure, Armenia imports Russian gas from faraway Siberia. It relies on pipelines that cross neighboring Azerbaijan, with which it is at war over Nagorno-Karabakh, through Turkey, a historic adversary, and Georgia, which controls Armenia's only land connection with Europe, as well as its access to Black Sea ports. So with those two suggestions, I'll turn back to our moderator. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Well, before we open up to general questions from the audience, I thought I'd pose one question that I thought was raised in each of these presentations in a different way, and that is an analytical question, which is, are we worried about Russia in Eurasia primarily because Russia is strong, or in fact is Russia's situation vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis European powers actually one of relative and weakness and even declining power in the future? So I thought maybe I'd start by putting that question to Stephen. In the oil and gas context, on the one hand, we have this trope of Russia as an energy superpower, and indeed, in terms of the volume of oil that it sells, it is. On the other hand, there's, in John McCain's somewhat famous words, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country thesis, which is that actually Russia only sells oil and gas and can't develop other technologies because of its dependence. So Stephen, when you look at Russia in that context, do you see a country that is strong and growing stronger every day, or rather a country that is weak and declining?
I'm not sure I'd put it quite in those terms. So in the oil business, the importance of Russia has nothing to do with Europe. It really has to do with Iran and the Persian Gulf region. So we now had this OPEC deal that came around where OPEC agreed to cut, I don't know how much it was, 1.4 million barrels a day. And in essence, Russia led the ROPEC or non-OPEC group, which is another, I think, 12 countries, to cut another, I forget the number, 600,000 or 800,000 barrels a day, of which the Russians are contributing 600,000. So Russia has become a near de facto member of OPEC and a near de facto leading member of OPEC. So if you looked at kind of functionally where the leadership of OPEC is, I would say it's between the Saudis and the Russians as a functional matter. And Russia is the one who gathered these non-OPEC countries to contribute cuts, and very impressively, including things like Mexico and Kazakhstan and other places that really we didn't expect. So I think from the oil perspective, Russia right now is at an interesting point. That's why I'm not sure whether to describe it as rising or falling. It's more just where it is. It has a lot of pressure on it right now to be credible. Right, because the whole OPEC deal, is this going to hang together or not, hinges a lot on compliance. And we know the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Emiratis will comply because they're the core of it. The question is, what do the Russians do? So I think that's part of it. If I look at the geopolitical part of it, and I put on my Hungarian hat here, the Russians are always problem children. It just is. Civilization, in Europe, starts at Britain and declines as you go east. And it's just that way, and I'm sorry to say it, but that's pretty much at least the Hungarian view. And And the Russians just always struggle to fit in and behave in some appropriate manner, in my experience. So there's a struggle now between being clever for Putin, right, and playing the outside game and trying to be really cute. And that's kind of the problem we saw with the systematic cheating at the Olympics, right? So what's that kind of mentality? That's a middle-ranked country trying to act like a big country. So it's desperately trying to force it. So now you have Putin who, okay, now he's got Crimea, that's great. But those sanctions, you look at the GDP numbers, and when I said, it's costing them $1 trillion, that's my analysis. It's costing them a huge amount of money because they're not able to conduct business normally, right? So he's kind of become a sort of mini Saddam Hussein character on the periphery of Europe who's kind of trapped now in these sanctions. The question is whether they come off them or not. So I'm not sure I answered your question. I may have raised more questions than I answered here. I think Russia is very important in the organization of oil markets. As the second biggest exporter, I think it has now taken a de facto pivotal role in OPEC or OPEC-type things. I think it remains a problem child in Europe simply because the Russians always struggled to play nice, and secondly, because Putin is now in a position where he's got these sanctions on him. He now has Crimea. He's not in a position to give it back, so he can't spit and he can't swallow, and that's kind of a structural problem.
Well, let me put the same question now to Anna in the context of gas markets. So we talked about the different pipeline designs through the Baltic Sea with Nord Stream, through the Black Sea with Turk Stream or South Stream. Do you see all of these pipeline projects as evidence of Russia's successful strategy to find a route around Ukraine? Or is the fact that they're actually taking a very long time to develop evidence that, in fact, Russia's energy toolkit is much more limited than we think?
Well, what we see nowadays in the natural gas markets, it's that there are just more places to get the natural gas from. Whether or not the shale is going to get developed in Europe, it doesn't look like it's going to be in any near future. But LNG is really up and going, and we see a huge development towards LNG imports in both the Western Europe, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, which was the part of Europe that was mostly dependent on Russia for natural gas, where Russia was actually getting its geopolitical influence from mostly. So West can do without possibly Russian gas much easier than the Central and Eastern Europe can. But it's now that there is this push for getting Central and Eastern Europe independent of natural gas from Russia. That includes LNG terminals in Poland, in Lithuania, Latvia looking for ways to store natural gas. So even if they would be getting that natural gas from Russia, they'll be able to store, and they actually have natural caverns that can store quite a lot of natural gas. They're trying to attract investment nowadays. So there's this huge push for different ways of getting natural gas. Now, whether there's going to be pipelines developed coming from Azerbaijan or from Russia, there's going to be more of it. So when you add all of this together, more pipelines, whether it's going to be the Turkish stream or Nord Stream, even Nord Stream 2, or whether it's going to be an additional pipeline going through Belarus, there's going to be more ways to supply yourself with natural gas, which basically makes Russia's position weaker, right? Because if you end up with more pipelines, LNG, now Russia will be in the weaker position where it has to actually be we'll be fighting for getting its natural gas onto the European markets. It will remain the supplier of European gas. I mean, it's just cheapest, pretty much. But it will be in a weaker position. And that goes also, and that's why it is eyeing China and Asia generally to supply natural gas there. But it also there, it's basically faced with the fact that it's weaker. And that's why even though Russia and China have signed an agreement to build a pipeline to pipe natural gas to China, it hasn't moved much because China has the upper hand and Russia is really struggling whether or not it wants to invest so much into the pipeline that it might later make it dependent on other power like China. And the fact with natural gas pipelines, the country that bears the risk and the cost is the country of supply. So I think in terms of natural gas, Russia's geopolitical position, it's weaker.
Dan, maybe let me change the subject of the question, from Russia, but to the European Union. On the one hand, you told a story of Trojan horses inside the EU, of a slew of elections that might go in a way that lead to more disintegration. On the other hand, you talked about effective regulation that was able to force more competition in energy markets and diversify energy supply. So if you had to assess European policy thus far, would you say it's been kind of a glass half full story versus a half empty story? And looking forward, do you think Europe is a rising power vis-a-vis Russia, or is in fact Russia going to be in a better position in 5 years than it is today?
I think in your half full, half empty, I mean, that's hard to answer. I think on energy, you could just, what I would say is that the EU has underperformed in integrating its energy market relative to its integration of other aspects of the common market, right? So energy, given that it's an area they've been working on for years, it's been slow to develop, but there has been an acceleration since 2009. So we're seeing progress. I mean, looking to your question about 5 years out and the relative power of the two, and it kind of comes back to the way you formulated the question before for the other two panelists. I mean, I see Russia as a weak and declining power, essentially, that the key to their strength, other than the stranglehold of gas supplies of a few of the countries, is essentially their willingness to violate international norms, right? So there's this anecdote, probably a lot of you read, I think it was, I can't remember which magazine I read it in, but some anecdote that apparently Putin tells sometimes about this rat he had cornered in a stairwell that then burst out at him, and how that really impressed him as a young man. It's sort of like that to me, that when you look at the Russian behavior, is 2011 there was protests, right, and I think there was nervousness among Putin and those around him that his regime might go the way of some others, right, fell to color revolutions, and then his reaction was to go very aggressive, right, and to seek to, I mean, his goal without question vis-a-vis the EU, and we're seeing this now echoed by the Trump administration, is he wants to destroy the European Union. I mean, NATO also, sure, but if we stick with the EU, he wants to destroy the EU because he sees, both in energy and in other domains, that a united Europe is an existential threat in many ways and presents a strong alternative vision of what the future could look like to the Russian people. So he wants to destroy it. But I think despite the best efforts of populists on the far right and some on the far left in Europe, in the end, I don't think that will happen. And as I tried to say, with the 2017 elections, although it's scary what's happening with Le Pen leading, Wilders leading, et cetera, I think in the end we're not going to have, Le Pen won't be French president, Wilders won't be prime minister of the Netherlands, and the AfD in Germany won't get more than 10% or something. So in the end, the center will hold this year, I think.
Well, John, let me pose, again, a slight variation of the question for you. On the one hand, you have a story of a lot of weak Eastern European governments, Bulgaria, Romania, that have a lot of Russian influence in their politics. On the other hand, the story that you've told shows that Russia is influencing them, but also Russia itself feels like it's threatened by policies that they're implementing. So you have the Kaliningrad, which is a Russian territory surrounded by other countries. Is Russia more at risk from these type of energy politics you've outlined? Or is it more able to use them as tools in influencing its neighbors?
I wouldn't underestimate Russian resilience and the ability to take a poor hand and to play a poor hand well. So I guess there are two things that matter in playing poker. One is to have good cards. The second is to play whatever cards you have well. And first is the matter of chance. The second is a matter of skill. I would say that the Russian leadership is very skilled. Chance may not favor Russia today, but chance is a way of turning as well. I think that part of being resilient is to position yourself for changing conditions and to capitalize on those changes. I think the interest in shifting towards nuclear is certainly something that has interesting prospects for Russia and the Russian government, just simply given their capabilities, technical capabilities there, and longstanding relationships in certain parts of the world. I also think, and not to be underestimated factor that's not strictly energy but has energy implications, is the demonstrated ability of the Russian government to have an effect on democratic elections within NATO. And I don't mean this through invidious means. I mean simply understanding how how these countries work and how the electoral processes work, Moldova is a great example of that. So you have Moldova, now you have Bulgaria. You have seen a move, an effective move of Russian influence and Russian interests into Western elections. So my sense, not to overstrain the metaphor, is that Russia effectively plays the hand it's dealt. It plays it well. It understands that part of it is to stay in the game and to remain there so that when fortune turns, you can capitalize on that.
Well, I'd be happy now to open it to questions if there are indeed questions from the audience. If you could line up, please, behind the microphone so that you can be heard by all the other audience. And I would just reiterate again, we'd be very interested in questions, but less so in comments. So please keep your questions short and to the point. And if you also wouldn't mind introducing yourself as well, please.
Bob Ramson. I'm trying to get my mind around oil and gas as a geopolitical tool for the United States in the world that we're heading into with the new administration. And I guess it's fair to assume that the production of oil and gas will be able to be increased because of diminished emphasis on environmental considerations. And I guess my question is, what's kind of the cross-elasticity of supply between U.S. oil and gas and Eastern European, primarily Russian oil and gas, vis-a-vis, I guess from America, it's got to come with LNG vessels. Are there enough LNG vessels? What's the time to build them? What's the cost to build them? How does all this play in to America using its advantage as a geopolitical tool?
Stephen, could I
Yeah, I
pass
can
that
take
to you?
that. So in terms of responsiveness, FSU, or Russian oil production, has been rising steadily but slowly. So about a couple of 100,000 barrels per day per year on 11, call it a base of 11 million barrels and a couple 100,000 per year increase, mostly from Russia. If we look at that in global terms, this year will probably increase global demand by 1.4 million barrels. So it's 1/7, 1/10 in a normal year. The Russians won't be up this year, obviously, because of the OPEC deal. But so Russia incrementally adds to the supply. It is not a huge gainer in the last several years, but it is going up, and it's big. So that's the Russian side. The U.S. side, that is simply the reality of fracking has changed the world and has dramatically changed the geopolitical balance because it has cratered the price of oil. To give you an example, right now, if I believe the EIA, they have revised up U.S. shale production since October by 500,000 barrels a day almost. So, and that's just because guys had wells lying around and, they were choking back production. It looks like we had some more reserves than we thought. So the U.S. shale growth capacity is still robust. It's very important, but it is a price-driven one. It's not driven by someone from on top. It's people watching price signals and bankers being willing to underwrite numbers. But it's there. It looks like it's pretty robust right now, and it's going to be the decisive sort of marginal player in setting global prices for the next several years. As for natural gas, the amount of natural gas that goes onto LNG is not huge. The U.S. is really getting started now. It's really more, and I think maybe Anna can speak to this, but it's more creating price discipline around the edges. And that's really more the role of LNG than necessarily entirely changing where supply and demand is going through in the world. But I think I'll defer to you on that.
Yeah, the prices of natural gas nowadays do not warrant as much of the development, at least in the short term, as it actually happening. But the reason why the development is happening is that there is a prediction going forward in the mid to long term that there is going to be increased demand and increase in prices, which will basically bring supplies from the U.S. Going to other markets. Those markets may reach or may not reach Europe. It will depend on the cost of transportation to a great extent. U.S. is probably more interested actually in Asia, as most of the LNG suppliers, where they see that development really picking up going through 2020s towards 2030s. Europe's development is rather stagnant, and it's not viewed as it's gonna as it will pick up anytime soon. So yeah, it's more of a LNG is more of a future, what we're gonna see in the future, and there's not as much concern about having enough tankers or having enough LNG ships, although these are being built, but there is no shortage of those at this moment, and I don't predict there's gonna be in any time soon.
Dan or John, would you like to comment on the geopolitical ramifications of U.S. energy? No? All right, we'll take the next question then.
Well, actually, that's a good way to end that off, because my question is about the geopolitical kind of paradigm.
You're not off the hook. Yeah.
My name's Gordon, and I'm a PhD candidate at Northeastern University in Boston. John, I applaud your skepticism at the use of the word hybrid to, describe all different kinds of warfare and things. And I suppose that I have a passing interest in political theory, and I am particularly interested in what terms like geopolitics leave out of an analysis. Not because of any kind of, bad reason, but just we choose to focus on other things. In terms of energy security, there are other interesting things happening in Africa. Rosatom appears to have just finalized its bid for South African nuclear reactor production, and I also know of something happening in Egypt as well. My question is, when we focus on Eurasia and oil and gas pipelines and nuclear developments and things, are we not perhaps leaving out of the analysis something that Russia appears to be trying to do on a more global scale? Why is it that they're spending money in South Africa? Why Egypt? Is there something bigger that's happening here?
Thank you. John?
Sure. Let me answer that and take you to a slightly different part of the world to illustrate. That is, Russia, I think I just read this, just recently passed Saudi Arabia as the leading gas supplier to China, which has been a long-term goal of Russia. One accomplishment in the last couple of years was the Russia having its claims recognized in the Sea of Okhotsk. So this is the maritime area sort of inside the Kuril Islands, outside of Kamchatka Peninsula. And Russia's claim there left a hole in the middle. Russia made an argument which had to do with continuity of the continental shelf. That argument was accepted by the United Nations, and Russia's claim to that area was granted. It's important in a couple different ways. One is it's probably the most hydrocarbon-rich part of that waterway. Second is it positions Russia ideally to expand supply when the market opportunity presents in Asia. And the third is it established a very important geopolitical point, which was it's the foundation for Russian continental shelf claims that theoretically run throughout the entire Arctic and down towards the South China Sea. So a continuous continental shelf is a continuous shelf. Russia is in a very advantageous position to make these land claims, which will allow it both potentially to have access to hydrocarbon resources, but also simply to muddle the geopolitical environment in that part of the world as it becomes a much larger supplier in Asia. So yes, the Russian energy policy, I think we tend to think of energy policy as a Department of Energy, and of course forgetting the Department of Energy has a lot to do with things that have not much to do with energy. But the point is that we sort of stovepipe it and think, well, we have an energy policy and a security policy and an intelligence policy, and they tend to look at it, if there's a hybrid approach that they take, they tend to look at energy in a much broader context, and it tends to serve much broader geopolitical interests.
So 2 questions. First is for Stephen. Can you talk a little bit about sanctions policy, what you expect under Trump? And can you talk a little bit about the new Cardin bill that was proposed on January 11th? Maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about that and whether you think it has any legs.
What was the second one?
The Cardin bill that was proposed in Congress on sanctions. It would be a way, so basically Trump has said that he's thinking about giving the Russians sanctions relief, and this bill that's been proposed would be a way to codify the old executive orders that Obama put in place. It's been proposed, and there's at least 10 sponsors behind it. I'm wondering if you think it has any legs. The second question I had was for John. On your question on RT, I've made a similar argument that the rankings are very, very minimal, but isn't that sort of beside the point? RT stories are picked up routinely by mainstream media, and isn't that something to pay attention to? Do you think that RT should be forced to register as a foreign agent?
So I'll take the first one. I'll be short on it. To be perfectly honest, I have no clue what the Trump administration is going to do. I think getting here today is going to be emblematic of living with the Trump administration. You get there and then you have to drive around for an hour. I'm not going to handicap it. I can tell you that, I deal with hedge fund guys and oil traders, and I think, our jaw really hasn't been taken off the table for the last week or so. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know whether Trump's rather romantic notions are going to prevail here, that we're all going to be chummy-chummy. I personally doubt that. If you look at the guys around him, they're almost all hawks. And I think that the disagreements with the Russians they're substantive, not stylistic. More so than with anybody else. I mean, with the Chinese, even I can make a case that the differences are really kind of stylistic. I know there's the South China Sea stuff, but with the Russians, they really did invade Ukraine. They really did invade Crimea. I mean, it's hard to argue with those facts on the ground at some level. In any event, I don't know what the Trump administration is going to be doing. I'm really right now. I'm a passenger, not a driver.
With respect to RT, again, I don't think anybody who's ever watched it for any period of time could take RT America seriously. So it's not as if we're going to be persuaded to do anything. With respect to RT stories being picked up, they are. But when you look at what those stories are, it's cat videos and relatively inconsequential stuff. So that's not to diminish the engine that RT's built, which I think is substantial, and it's not to diminish the effect of, as I had said, of Russian agitprop in Central and Eastern Europe. And to some extent, you wonder whether such a poorly produced product here is intended, and this is sort of gets into old Sovietology days, whether intended as simply a ruse to make you think that, well, that's the consistent thread that runs throughout Russian agitprop, and it certainly is not. They're very effective. I think their use of media and use of information in Central and Eastern Europe, in large part because they're conversant in the cultures and the languages. So I guess note to whomever's coming in, if you want to have an effect and an influence in Hungary and Bulgaria, it might be a good place to start by doing that in Hungarian and Bulgarian and actually reading what people in those media say. With respect to the foreign agent issue, I don't really have an opinion, which I would consider that to be a legal question, not a political question. But I would raise the question as to why, what utility there is for me throwing snowballs at my neighbor. If I have a point that I'm trying to make, or I think it's going to lead me to some desired end, then I think it might be a good idea to do it. To do it just to irritate somebody, to me seems to accomplish little and looks rather petty, and I think would put RT in a position where it would look far more influential than it in fact is.
Dan? Great.
My name is Claudia Farris. In considering issues of such broad scope, I think it's wise to look at the forces shaping the second and third order of change. Also, these are not isolated issues, they're contextual, and there are all kinds of forces playing on the outcome. So my question is, actually I'd ask you to speculate on what would happen if Trump were to release not what's going to happen, but what would happen if he were to release the sanctions. What can you think of for me about the effects of domestic policy changes, about fracking, for example, given the environmental concerns in this country? Can you think for me about the consequences in NATO of so many of the new countries being Russian, former Soviet nations? Turkey is a member of NATO, and they are yet playing such a huge role in this Eurasian picture. So I'm asking you to think about the forces that are shaping the second and third orders of change in this, and tell us what that world looks like, please.
I'll take the fracking one. So one of the questions is, what will Trump mean for the oil business?
No, what if under Trump, we release the Russian sanctions?
Yeah, I'm going to pass on that one. But let me tell you, we've been talking a lot about purchasing land in Patagonia recently. So, I'm not going to speculate on what could go, because things could go really far south. There are scenarios that are really pretty bad, and I don't think we're there today. And I'll leave that to others. As for fracking, just a quick answer. Trump will be generally positive for fracking and pipelines, I think. I don't think it changes the landscape right now. We have lots of gas, we have lots of oil. I think the most important venue for us is going to be Alaska, because they really have a problem up there. But other than that, I think it's a generally positive, not material today.
Well, in terms of the sanctions, we have to look at what these sanctions accomplish, especially from the U.S. point of view. One was that a lot of the know-how was basically retracted, and part of the know-how was coming from the American companies, like ExxonMobil's drilling in Antarctica. The price point of oil is such now that probably ExxonMobil won't be that interested to go there. Same goes for a lot of the other know-how that American companies may provide. Otherwise, it's more of the sanction. A lot of the sanctions were related to the financials of Russian companies, oil and gas companies, and Russian individuals related to them. So that would be more of basically economics of the companies that will be helped going forward.
Maybe something I can add something on these sort of second, third order big picture shifts you're asking about. I mean, I guess one question for the EU a lot of people are asking is, the sort of the deepest question is whether we will see the twin forces of pressure from Russia, efforts to undermine European elections, to divide the Union, and then on the other hand, that being now coupled with similar pressures perhaps from the Trump administration, where you probably saw last week in interviews Trump was saying he thought Brexit was a great thing. He expects, and he more or less suggested he thinks it would be good if others followed them out, said the EU is a vehicle for German dominance of Europe, all these things. So one question is, will that, that pressure from these two external powers, either force Europe sort of together finally, saying, well, we better hang together or hang separately, or will it lead to the outcome that those pressures seek, which is the dissolution of the EU? I mean, frankly, although it's not maybe the most satisfying answer, I don't think we'll see dramatic moves in either direction. It's not like the EU is going to turn around tomorrow and say, take great leaps forward in its common defense policy and have a European army and all those things and a fully completed energy union, but nor are we about to see the EU unravel. I mean, I've looked into this, thought about it very carefully. I don't think any other member state is going to leave, right, other than the UK. I mean, the UK may split apart. That's quite possible in the next few years. But so I think, as unsatisfying as it is, I think we'll have this kind of stumbling forward towards gradual, deeper integration, but not very quickly or effectively.
John?
No, I think they covered it well.
Just going quickly to the fracking and environmental issues that you've mentioned, being concerned about it. A lot of that environmental legislation that's going on is going on the state level, and I think a lot of us forget about it, that when people get scared about how the administration will affect us, they rightly so, but at the same time, there is a lot of momentum within states already that's been undertaken that it doesn't seem that's going to retract. So the concern is probably not as strong as if the EPA was only driving the process of environmental protection and other issues. So there's a lot of state level legislation, and I've been looking actually recently through that legislation going all the way to 2009 that's continuously increasing in order to make fracking less environmentally problematic on the state level.
Hello, My question has to do with what Anna said during her speech. I was wondering about, so you mentioned during your speech how LNG and switching to Nord Stream and South Stream would be very good ways for the EU to deal with the resurgence in Russian strength in energy policy. However, I was wondering if we might see more of a switch towards nuclear options, such as Dan has mentioned, or if we could see more of a switch towards more alternative energies and environmentally friendly energies, as the Nordic countries have done.
Nuclear energy is an issue in Europe, and we've seen it with Germany basically giving up on nuclear power altogether. With France, which is dependent on nuclear energy to a great extent, we see also aging of a lot of nuclear facilities, and the country actually will have an issue of replacing them, given how strong the opposition to nuclear power is generally among the European public. So that's the problem. There is a very strong support for renewable energy in Europe, and we see quite a lot of progress. But at the same time, when we do see a lot of kind of retirement of nuclear power and going against the fossil fuels, at the same time we see that we have actually more coal-fired power plants providing more energy. So unfortunately, renewable energy does not provide us enough around-the-clock supply to be able to rely on it exclusively. We will need others, and generally natural gas is the better option. The problem with natural gas in Europe is that it comes in a great extent from Russia. So cutting natural gas or dependence on Russia, cutting nuclear is gonna drive some of the renewable, but unfortunately a lot of what's gonna drive is gonna drive more reliance on coal, which is not necessarily what people wanna have.
Any other comments? Sir?
Val Kogan, Mid-Atlantic Eurasia Business Council. 15 years ago, in very same building, we hosted the Russian delegation that ecologists that actually ask questions, discuss their concern about the development in Arctics and at that time. And my first question that, do you think with the new American administration and new Secretary of State, is it what you would think about this development? And second question, back to the one that just discussed, the development in the various renewable energy, both in US and of course in Germany and in China. Is it some way playing a role, can potentially play a role in the new developments? Thanks.
So the question on Arctic and renewables. With respect to Arctic, I think Arctic is somewhat underappreciated outside of probably some narrow defense and particularly maritime circles, to the extent that observed climate change has altered the defense proposition in Russia, because it's created, in effect, a large and, to a great extent, undefended or underdefended border that's been inaccessible and is now largely accessible and likely to become more so. So Russian activity in the Arctic is driven by some very practical needs like energy development, but I think there is a much underrated question there that ought to be given further consideration with respect to what it does to Russian defense policy and how Russia will choose to defend that border, particularly if it perceives that it's in a risky environment. So more to be seen there. I think energy and defense will go hand in hand in that environment, and it will put a much greater emphasis on maritime assets, both for Russia and for us and others than we've seen before. On the renewable side, I want to sort of loop back to the nuclear question. I would give Mr. Putin full credit for being a relatively adept reader of political trends and political movements in the West. And this interesting movement or reemphasis of nuclear within Russia is a rather interesting one as a way of trying to leverage national interests in energy independence. Nuclear has always held that promise out Russia's in a particularly good position because of Rosatom and its technical capabilities to capitalize on that, and it's a great way to reestablish oneself in countries that it may have had a footprint in before or may have never had a footprint in. Particularly with Germany taking itself out of the nuclear realm, it creates this rather sharp contradistinction that I think Russian policy has perceived and has moved rather artfully towards in the last couple of years.
Great, and we'll take our final question, please.
Yes, Ben Pributok. This is possibly a grim one on which to wrap up, but I'm wondering, given the increasingly zero-sum world in which we live, the neutralization of the United States, effectively, the leverage that Mr. Putin exercises over Ukraine, the disarray of the EU, the fact that the war in the Ukraine has never ended, it's on kind of a low simmer. I wonder if you would rate, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you'd like, the probabilities that we may see a kind of Russian Anschluss in eastern Ukraine and the Baltics. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of grim.
Who would stop? Who would stop?
Well, I mean, it depends on, right, if you have a approximate danger, then population tends to react to that. The question is, when that danger is your neighbor's neighbor, the reaction might be a little bit different. You know, I really think right now almost all the risk is in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, yes, there are problems with the Chinese in the South China Sea. Yes, that's an issue. The Iranians are an issue, and the Russians are an issue, and some of those Russian issues are actually real issues for the Russians, not just trumped up ones by the Putin administration. But I think at this point, the real question is, you know, what happens in Washington? I mean, it's really, you know, a month from now, this may be an entirely different conversation than we're having today. Well, no, he's taken power, but we don't know how that's going to cascade out, because there are three ways you can go. The one way is that we do new innovative things, so let me put that to the side for the moment. But the other two are that we get some sort of really wacky policy that is unmoored from the establishment views that have prevailed for a long time in the US. And the other is that the establishment reasserts itself, right, over a period of time where they say, well, yes, that's true, Mr. Trump, and you know, we could nuke Moldova, but perhaps there are a few reasons why we might not want to do that. So the question is where this balance of power is going to come out yet, and I, for one, I don't have a clear view of where that's going to be. Maybe the other panelists have more insight than I do.
Would anyone else like to speculate on that question?
Well, I guess my starting point is I tend not to look at zero sum as a likely outcome in any situation. I mean, a general approach to game theory is that you're going to have a positive or negative sum game. So it's not a balancing act, and I think that goes in with this idea of balance of power, which to me is a somewhat obscure notion. That being said, the situation in eastern Ukraine is not, I think it's changed from a situation where Russian interests have in effect cleared out some of the more contentious folks on their side and not effectively, we've artlessly done that. The Minsk process has largely ceased to function. So Ukraine is to a great extent at the mercy of others being the Europeans, Russia, and we've sat in the sidelines there. The unintended effect of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, particularly the ramping down of it, and Ukraine's changing approach, has been to release, for example, militias that it was very dependent upon in the early part of the conflict and would rather not be dependent upon to go off and do other things. So there are political dynamics within Ukraine that have been exacerbated actually by the de-escalation of the conflict there, not the escalation of it. And to some extent, you might make the argument that it's politically more useful for Russian interests for that for that campaign to stay at a relatively low ebb. It's not a low ebb if you're one of the people being shelled, but for those of us on the outside, and watch those forces go elsewhere. So if you look at the activities of the Azov Brigade, which was at one time very much part of the conflict, and very much now off doing other things, none of which are good for the future of Ukraine as a nation, and certainly not Ukrainian democracy, that's not a zero sum, that's probably a negative sum for Ukraine. Trying to rate those factors going forward, I think that anyone who believes in that kind of modeling understands that it's far too complex to model out. So what's likely to happen is what's happening today, which is a continual grinding of the situation there with a lack of clear resolution, which to some extent that's exactly what some of the parties involved in the conflict would hope.
I would just add, since you invoked the Baltics, I mean, I definitely don't think we're going to see, let's say, Russian incursions, other than the sort of little things they've been doing with flyovers and whatnot, into any countries that are in NATO or in the EU. I think that countries, the Ukraine being obviously the one where this already happened, but I think basically all the countries, sort of the in-betweeners, right, Moldova, countries like that, I think we're going to see just increasing Russian, I mean, we already have deep Russian interference in their domestic politics, but I think, you know, the US will basically be abandoning those countries, and the EU largely too, to sort of Russian sphere of influence. Because also, you know, from the EU side, they have nothing credible to offer anymore, because everyone knows that enlargement is done for many years to come, right? So that kind of carrot, you know, that was there before, I think, you know, is gone. I think you know, the way the EU will react to this geopolitical environment going forward is to embrace a kind of more and more of a fortress Europe, both because of you know, the Russian threat, and we saw, of course, you know, with the U.S. also supporting this, putting more NATO boots on the ground in countries on the periphery, but also in reaction to the refugee crisis and the formation of a European border and coast guard. In fact, the Commission's new mantra for its sort of vision going forward to try to appeal to citizens is a Europe that protects, right? It's kind of vague, but that's you know, the vision they have going forward. So border security, military security, I think they'll ramp up spending a bit finally on defense, some of the countries.
Also, I wonder to what extent the fact that this crisis is still simmering in Ukraine may actually persuade Putin from going forward towards other countries. The fact that this is not a closed chapter, that people just didn't, you know, wash their hands, and we just kind of, we didn't get over it, as well as people who live in Ukraine didn't get over it. Moving to other countries like Baltics, or, you know, might not be that beneficial nor inciting for Putin, just because he would have to spend a lot of resources and energy getting there, and not necessarily getting what he wants from basically ruling those countries, especially if he can have some other type of influence, political influence, without having to basically encroach on the territory of those countries.
I'd add just to that, I mean, I think Putin's a proud man. He doesn't like the fact that he's not in the G7. He doesn't like the fact that he's on the periphery. That annoys him, and that's why you have those flyovers, in part because it's the guy who's on the outside of the playground just being unhappy about it. So I agree with you. I think that the goal for him is to rehabilitate both himself and Russia in its international standing.
Right. Well, with that, we should probably wrap up our panel. I will say that the questions that were raised today, discussion, debate will continue throughout the year for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We've actually just launched a new publication series on the Black Sea that addresses some of these very questions. So I encourage you, as a brief plug, to check out our website where those are published. Our next panel will start at 3 p.m. on the dot. Before then, please join me in thanking our panelists today.
That was really interesting. I learned a lot. Thanks.
Hope everybody is thoroughly rested. In introducing the next panel, before introducing the next panel, I want to, first of all, thank, and second of all, highlight the work of Chris Miller, who chaired the panel. And despite his youthful appearance, his accomplishments are many, but above all, he and Maya Otarashvili, whom we did recognize earlier as one of the pillars of this new Eurasian initiative at FPRI that we launched a year ago, we have not only put out a series of Baltic bulletins over the last year, how many, 26? On the Baltics, and that's one of the key issues with harassment and the gas transit in the Baltic Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And then this Black Sea initiative that consists of several items. One, the focuses on the Caucasus, and of course that includes Georgia and some of the pipeline issues we heard about. Another focuses on Moldova, where you have a frozen conflict and is very much, and was mentioned in the energy equation as well, and the pipeline equation. And then Black Sea Strategy Papers is the title we've given it. It's an immensely strategic region, and the first paper is up. Please go to the FPRI website. We hope you are already members or will join FPRI. And there are, I believe, do we still have at the back, Reggie and Tatiana, do we have forums with which you can join FPRI? Okay, and there are two important events coming up of special interest. One is that Chris Miller, who just spoke, whom I just spoke about and who was the panel moderator, is having a book talk on a book that he has recently published, Yale University Press, and it's The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy. In other words, how the decline that we talked about a little bit in the first panel, how that happened, and why ultimately Gorbachev failed. Is that a fair way of putting it? So that's on February 2nd. It's free of charge, and it will be a great introduction to FPRI events. It'll be at the FPRI library, if I'm not mistaken, 1528 Walnut Street. But you have to sign up in advance. So please talk to Chris or the ladies. No, both are ladies at the back at the reception table and check-in table. The second event is one of our special events of the year on Sunday, April 23rd, our spring brunch. We will have General Philip Breedlove, who was the commander of NATO, of U.S. and European forces in Europe until just a couple of years back. And he will talk about Russia and the West from a strategic perspective, read military in the broadest sense, including hybrid and other types of action, use of force or non-traditional and rather antagonistic techniques. So therein lies, this concludes my pitch about FPRI and its Eurasia program. And I want to thank all the panelists from the first panel for doing such a terrific job. And secondly, I want to welcome the new panelists. Did we find Melinda's name tag?
Yes.
Oh, good, okay. So you can see their names, you have their bios. I would like very much to avoid asking the panel to please predict what Donald Trump and his administration are going to do, or please predict what the U.S. Congress is going to do. We don't know. What we are here for is to talk about what they should do. What is the U.S. national interest? You know, we have 230 years of history. We have history ahead of us. And it is people like you, opinion leaders, leaders in all walks of life, educators, thinkers, to help form and mobilize American opinion towards the correct policies, those which will maximize our long-term national interest and values, and away from foolhardy ideas. I'm not endorsing, implying that foolhardy ideas are the monopoly of one party or another, or one individual or another, but we're here to talk about what should be done in view of the very changed situation in Europe, Eurasia, 25 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I've asked the panel in a very disciplined fashion in advance of they're all getting together here today, 3 questions to address, please, in 5 to 7 minutes maximum each in the first round. 3 questions. Should the Trump administration's policies depart substantially from those of not only President Obama, but also of President Bush 43? Regarding Moscow's actions on Russia's western periphery, Moscow's actions with regard to NATO, and with regard to the EU, the things we heard about in the first panel. The question that I'm asking them to address is not will there be change? Speculate, will Mattis have his way or will Trump have his way? But rather, should there be change based on what is the true long-term U.S. national interest? That is what we're here to discuss. That's what think tanks exist for, that's what universities exist for, and that's what public service and policy and distinguished policy practitioners like our keynote speaker and many of those on the current and previous panel. That's what we live for. It's our job, to try to figure out the answers to those difficult questions. And finally, the third question I've asked them to address is, in connection, if there should be a change from the current administration, or even if you're defending from previous administration, or if you're defending the idea that there should not be any change, okay, that's based on what assumptions and what strategic goals you advocate for the United States. Justify your position. Third question I've asked our panel, it's admittedly overloading them a bit, but they're up to the task, I can assure you. And that is whether or not each individual panelist advocates a significant change from prior policy. Specifically, how specifically should the following issues be dealt with going forward? First, Ukraine. Second, the Russian military moves that we've heard so much about, military moves, hybrid warfare, and other covert actions against the Baltic states, against other NATO members, and against countries like Georgia and Moldova, and the EU as such. Another specific area, cyber attacks on these and other European allies, nuclear and ABM missile deployments, intrusion into the domestic politics of EU states. We've heard a lot about what's being done, but not what should be done to counter what's being done if we in fact think it's worth countering. And finally, the sanctity, two questions. The sanctity of European post-war borders, which has not been mentioned as such. The Helsinki agreements in the mid-1970s said Soviet Union at that time agreed with the West, these borders will be sacrosanct. Well, that's been violated. What should be done about the sanctity of borders? And finally, the uses of economic and energy supply leverage. That was very much discussed in the first panel, but our panelists may have somewhat different views. So with that, I would like to ask Stephen Blank. You have the bio, so I won't introduce the specifics. To lead off the discussion, we'll go in direct order, right to left.
Thank you, Adrian. I want to thank the organizers. It's a great honor to be here. In September, it'll be 50 years since I first learned about FPRI as a freshman at Penn, where my teacher, the late Alvin Rubenstein, was a charter member of FPRI, and I knew Harvey when he was a grad student. It was the same Harvey. He didn't change much over the years in that respect. And as a result, I'm really honored to be here. I want to talk not so much about what we have done or might do, but what the Russians want out of us. Because it is clear there is a process now underway leading to what looks like a summit. And while the Trump administration has not formulated what it wants out of Russia, and it's barely out of the gate, Mr. Putin's objectives are quite clear. And it's important for us to understand what those are so that if a deal is made with Russia or that if there's a process of negotiation, it is not simply what diplomats call an exchange of views, but a meaningful dialogue. We often hear in Washington there has to be a dialogue with Russia. Well, that's true. But as Reagan said, it takes two to tango. And if one just simply insists on his position, then there's no dialogue. It's an exchange of views. And what we have to understand, therefore, is that from the Russian point of view, they are at war with the United States. It's not a kinetic war. There's no combat operations. But it's whatever you want to call it, nonlinear, hybrid, whatever title you like. I don't like hybrid either, but a lot of people use it. Sergei Ivanov, at the time defense minister, January 18, 2005, tells the Academy of Military Sciences in Russia that Russia is under attack and at war, even though nobody has declared war on us. Why? Because they tried to make a coup in Ukraine and were thwarted. They tried to make a coup in Moldova, were thwarted. And they saw that it's not their fault that they lost, but it's, of course, ours. They saw us in Iraq, and therefore, from that point on, and you can see this in Russian foreign policy, the policy became ever more militant and anti-American. In 2016, just after he was sacked as chief of staff, for whatever reason, he gives an interview to the Financial Times, indicating that he's still in favor, because if you're not in favor, you don't give interviews to Western newspapers, saying that for us, information warfare in a Cold War is a fact of life. So all those people in this town and in Washington and elsewhere who are writing that we are starting a Cold War have it wrong. Russia started a Cold War with the United States 12 years ago, if not even earlier, and is still waging it. And as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. That means we have to be interested in war. Therefore, what does Moscow want to get out of this multidimensional, non-kinetic war, even though it is replete with military threats and military buildups in contested theaters, like Europe, like the Arctic? First of all, and in no particular order, it wants the U.S. to recognize Crimea as part of Russia and to put pressure on Ukraine to accept the Minsk Accords, which would essentially destroy Ukraine as an independent state by converting it into a confederation where Russia holds the whip hand and can veto anything the Ukrainian state does. That would end Ukrainian sovereignty in a flash. It wants NATO to be disarmed east of Germany. All the recent deployments and the projected deployments have to cease. It wants sanctions terminated unilaterally, because Putin says, we're not going to ask for it, you did it, you have to terminate it. Because he's not going to admit that sanctions are killing the Russian economy, which they are, and that the population is suffering as a result. He also wants no missile defenses, either in Europe or in Asia, though missile defenses in both places cannot really stop Russia's nuclear capability from threatening anybody. He wants Bashar Assad recognized as the ruler of all of Syria. And in general, that the United States accept Russia as its equal in Europe and in the Middle East. Now, what that amounts to is essentially that Russia is seen as a kind of partner of the U.S. as at the Yalta Conference in 1945. Putin went on about this at length in his UN speech 18 months ago. And that the United States cannot act in world affairs without consulting Russia first, because Russia, supposedly like the U.S., is a global superpower with global interests and capabilities, whose views must be taken into account, and that Russia's great power status, therefore, must be sacrosanct. In other words, we cannot interfere in Russia's interests, but Russia will have the ability to have leverage on everything we do. And that also means, as a seventh point, no democracy promotion. We cannot take an interest in what goes on internally in any of the post-Soviet states, or for that matter, anywhere else, because that's a threat to Russia as well. As Dmitry Trenin, the director of the Russian Carnegie Endowment, recently wrote, the United States should become a normal power with national interests and not just this kind of great power value projection that it is engaged in the last 25 years. That would make the Russian government very happy. This is not a program that any American president can or should accept, whether his name is Trump, Clinton, or any other name you choose. What should be done? Well, some of which started, but it needs to be ratcheted up. There is effectively no real strategy yet for the conventional defense of Europe, and the logistical obstacles to getting one there, which you don't read about in the papers, are even greater than you can imagine if you've ever served in the military. But read Wall Street Journal yesterday, for example, and you'll see that. Second, beyond the conventional deterrent that needs to be placed from the Baltic to the Black Sea, we need as well the promotion of European integration. Brexit was a disaster, and if it continues, it will continue to undermine the confidence and stability of the European Union. And when President Trump gets up there and says foolish and stupid things about the European Union, he ought to know better, because there are people in his administration who know better, and the allies know better as well. We need an information strategy to confront the entire paraphernalia of Russian information strategy and subversion of elections and political institutions across the West. It is not only in our elections, it is France, Germany, Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Great Britain, Bulgaria, on and on and on, where we see the systematic effort to subvert, corrupt, and pervert democratic institutions and undermine democratic stability. Sanctions not only should be maintained, but the United States should start exporting energy to Europe. There are interconnectors being built in Lithuania and Poland. As the price of gas comes up, as the previous panel pointed out, shale comes back online. Although most U.S. gas may be going to Asia, some of it ought to go to Europe as well. Other producers, such as the Gulf, North Africa, Latin America, Africa, can also send gas to Europe now, particularly LNG. Oil is not the issue here because oil is a freely traded commodity, whereas gas is much more politicized. Those gas sales will reduce Russia's revenues and put more pressure on the Russian economy and government because it's a direct basis not only of the Russian governmental administration, but of the elites lining of its pockets. And we hit them where they live. That way we get their attention. There must be more diplomatic support for Ukraine as well as continuing pressure on Ukraine to reform. I, for one, supported the idea of giving Ukraine the weapons to fight back. The idea that Russia maintains escalation dominance and can do so at will, that President Obama expressed, indicates an unwillingness to use the instruments of power in a disciplined and intelligent way to achieve strategic outcomes. It is not beyond our capacity, if we discipline ourselves and understand what is at stake, to do that. So that needs to be done as well. And finally, in the Middle East, we need to develop a coherent strategy to prevent the Russians from forming a bloc in the Middle East under their direction, composed of Iran, Iraq, and Syria, which goes back to what they tried to do after Camp David, and to leverage their position in the Middle East to thwart European access to the Middle East and to Turkey, because Turkey is in imminent danger. It is surrounded on all sides now by Russian military. It is too dependent on Russian energy, and it, of course, is going the wrong way democratically. And we need a strategy that not only keeps Turkey in the Western alliance, but that strengthens the Western alliance's ability to influence events in the Middle East. I will stop here because I've probably used up my time, but...
You're just on time.
Okay. But as a diplomat would say, I waive consecutive interpretation.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Melinda Herring. I'm a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm also the editor of the Atlantic Council's publication on Ukraine and Russia. It's called the Ukraine Alert, and we do 6 original articles every week. This is one of my favorite contributors, Dr. Stephen Blank, and I welcome you to subscribe. It's free. And I also wanted to say one other thing. I don't get a chance to come to Philadelphia very often. I've been involved with FPRI for 4 years, and I just want to thank you all because FPRI is so supportive, especially for younger scholars. Alan, Adrian, and Maya have given us so many opportunities. It says something. I want you to know that someone from Washington has sought out a relationship with a Philadelphia-based think tank. So thank you for all that you do, and it's really a pleasure to be involved with FPRI. So I study democracy, and my focus in particular is Ukraine. I wanted to also give one other plug. Our team at FPRI is about to publish a new book in February, and it's called Does Democracy Matter? And it couldn't be more timely. So I hope that in February, when this comes out, you'll get a chance to look at our book. So let's talk about U.S. foreign policy now. The new president has been consistent on at least one thing. He says he wants good relations with Russia. He told the Times of London, let's see what kind of deals we can get. He also said that he's open to sanctions relief in exchange for a nuclear deal. So it's clear that we're returning to a sphere of influence politics. This is going to be a massive shift in U.S. foreign policy. Trump said in his inaugural address, "We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone." Let's contrast this to George W. Bush, who said, "The advance of freedom is the calling of our time. It is the calling of our democracy. We believe that freedom is not for us alone. It is the right and capacity of all mankind." Now, the Obama administration was less enthusiastic about democracy promotion, but Obama wasn't actively opposed to it. Let me stop here and define my terms a little bit. So the the U.S. government uses its rhetoric and also money to support Democrats around the world. We spend $3 million annually on programs, including programs in the former Soviet Union. It's been a bipartisan effort, and it's something that's been going on for about 35 years. So let me give you a few concrete examples of what this is. So it's programs to support civil society groups in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. We're training media, and we're also encouraging women and young people to run as candidates. That's what we mean by democracy promotion. But something is massively going to change in the Trump administration. This will be the first administration since Carter that is actively opposed to democracy promotion and supporting our values abroad. We are looking at democracy promotion without the support of the executive. I don't have to tell this crowd that this is a president who's willing to make massive structural changes. Everyone in Washington who cares about advancing U.S. values and interests abroad is very worried right now. It's very bleak at USAID. It's very bleak at the State Department. Everyone is very nervous. But I'm going to take a more optimistic view. I think that this is a golden opportunity to renew democracy promotion and to renew our commitment to advancing democratic values abroad. Now, there's an irony that democracy promotion has enjoyed so much support from the executive that it hasn't really had to defend itself. It's become an entrenched part of U.S. foreign policy, and it doesn't have to do much deep thinking. In my opinion, it's become lazy, and a lot of the programs don't do a lot. They don't really push the envelope. They continue to just do the same old thing. And for too long, democracy promotion has been an elite bureaucratic concern. It's something that people in Washington care about. People in Indiana and Wyoming have no idea what I'm talking about, and they have no interest in it. But you know what? The Trump administration is going to change that and force this democracy promotion and this idea of advancing our values abroad probably to take refuge in Congress, which is the basis of our democracy. So in the end, I think this is going to provide a firmer basis for democracy promotion in the next 10 to 20 years. It's tough now to make this argument because democracy in the United States is in trouble. The Economist Intelligencer Unit just downgraded the United States from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. Now, don't get smug. They said quite clearly it's not Trump. The trust in government and elected officials has been declining for decades. This predates Trump. It goes back several decades. Freedom House also has noticed that democracy is in peril in the United States. But as U.S. democracy is tested, there will be common cause for fighting in this struggle together with Democrats abroad. Democracy is declining across the board. Freedom House has found that there's been a decline in worldwide scores for the last 10 years. Young democracies that once looked promising, like Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, are also declining. But the solution to this decline is not to retreat into isolation. The best way that the U.S. can support these courageous reformers and Democrats in places like Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova is for ordinary Americans to identify with this struggle. And I think increasingly there's going to be more opportunity for people to work together. I think this is also an opportunity for scholars to demonstrate that democracy is a good that's tied to all sorts of very good outcomes. Scholars have done a very good job of demonstrating that democracy is tied to peace and prosperity, religious freedom, tolerance, the list goes on and on. But these are mostly academic debates, and they need to be taken into the policy realm. We need to be making the argument for why democracy matters and why it's important. And I think this is also an opportunity to examine the efficacy of our democracy promotion efforts. So we spend $3 billion a year on this stuff. Does it actually work? No one knows the answer to this question for a variety of reasons. I've spent a lot of time at the Foreign Policy Research Institute thinking about this question, and one way we could easily make our work more effective is working through the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a small, lean and mean organization, and also working in countries that want to make progress and change. And I would put Ukraine high on that list. So in conclusion, I think that this is actually a golden opportunity to renew our commitment to promoting democracy around the world. Thank you.
Seven.
Hi, I'm Mitchell Ornstein, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers for putting on this excellent conference. I want to take a slightly different tack again from either Stephen or Adrian. I do believe that probably when advising the government, it does depend. It does matter which government you're advising, in my view, right? And this government for sure wants a reset with Russia. There's no question about it, right? Trump has made many Russia-friendly comments. He's indicated that he wants to have a summit as a sort of first priority of business. And so I'm going to direct my comments towards evaluating what this Trump reset would and should look like, and what some of the problems and dilemmas it has, and how those could be addressed. So the central problem, and here I agree entirely with what Stephen Blank said, the central problem of the Trump reset is that Russia wants a lot more from us than we actually want or need from Russia. I won't enumerate the list I was going to give. It's pretty similar to Stephen's list of what Russia wants from us. I mean, they want a lot of things from us, that are a lot of which are pretty hard for us to give, or have been hard for us to give. On the on the other hand, what we really need from Russia is pretty limited. I mean, to some extent, we need them to have a better position on Ukraine and to allow Ukraine to have sovereignty. To some extent, we need to have their cooperation in the Middle East. And to some extent, we would like them to stop their cyber warfare. But none of these are quite as strategic or important as all the long laundry list of things that they need for us. The dilemma of the Trump reset is, first of all, that Trump wants to give Russia for free many of the things on their list, right? So in particular, the Crimea, recognition of Crimea is something he noted as kind of a done deal. The attempt to sort of pull apart the European Union, as mentioned before, is something that's not something that he's really particularly opposed to. Sanctions are something he would like to get rid of. Doing more deals, oil deals with Russia, is something he would prefer. So the issue is that you have a negotiation in which one part wants a huge amount and the other party is kind of willing to give a lot of stuff for nothing. So that just looks like stealing your lunch money, right? So the question is, I think the question for the Trump reset is, how does the United States get something that's hard for Russia to give, right, out of this negotiation? And I think there are some ways to do that. I think that Trump actually mooted an idea that hasn't received any discussion here, so I'll be the first to mention it, which is that he wants a very substantial nuclear arms reductions to be part of any deal with Russia. And that's a very clever, I think, approach in the respect that if you think about it, Russia is a weak and declining power. Its main trump card, so to speak, on the international stage is that it has all these nuclear weapons. And they even think they have more than we do, which may be true. I'm not sure about that. And they think that they're more strategically capable of doing harm to us than we are to them. So if that's their trump card, I mean, Trump's pretty smart to think about taking that off the table to some degree. So I think that could be a feasible strategy for a reset negotiation to try and create some sort of dramatic limitation of nuclear weapons that would be more dramatic on the Russian side than for us. Another thing I think that I would suggest is that very often our resets, and remember, Trump's not the only politician or president to have come in suggesting a reset. Obama came in suggesting a reset as well, as did in his own way George W. Bush. And the reason's clear because you want to have good relations with Russia, but I think the flawed strategy of the previous two presidents was to, in essence, trade concessions in Europe for things that we thought we were getting in the Middle East. In other words, the United States would let Russia do certain things that it wanted to do in Europe in exchange for helping us do things that we thought we needed to do in the Middle East. That, by the way, turned into more or less of a disaster. So I think that that formula should be sort of reversed, in essence. In other words, we should be willing to give away, and Stephen's sort of like flinching here. I think we should be willing to trade away things that are ephemeral in the Middle East in exchange for things that are very real with regard to European security. meaning holding a hard line on Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. I also think, and this is a reaction in part to the previous panel, that, that Russia has somewhat altered its oil and gas strategy recently, and I've been trying to think about a way to encapsulate that. In essence, Russia wants to have a higher price of gas, right? And that's why it's joining with OPEC, and that's why it's kind of teaming up with different oil producers to kind of have a foot in their game so that they can somehow act as leverage to increase oil prices. And of course, the West, generally speaking, wants oil prices to go down because it doesn't want to reward developing states that are reliant on oil, and it doesn't want to pay that much money for its energy inputs. I think that in a way, there may be a deal to be reached in this respect here too. That if Russia is in fact playing a game where it is sort of teaming up with Saudi Arabia in OPEC, teaming up with Iran around nuclear and oil export deals and gas export deals, teaming up with Turkey on transport deals, you know, the US can kind of play that game too, right? The US can also play the game of being sort of an ever-present energy broker, not necessarily controlling, and here's where I maybe depart with Stephen. I don't think that Russia really has a prospect of controlling Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, but maintaining a foot in that game and possibly in some sort of agreement or in some sort of partnership with Russian companies as well, that is a way to weaken Russia's resolve to destroy us and to destroy our influence in the world, which I think revolves a lot around its efforts to prop up the oil price. I think if you think about why it's really out there in the world, yes, it's there for prestige, but its big business is oil. It is a gas station, right? Masquerading as a country. It makes its money off of oil. It has a fundamental interest in pushing up oil prices, and it plays that game. And it sees us playing that game against them. If we can somehow cooperate in those venues, then I can imagine that being possible. However, it has to be said that our efforts to reset relations with Russia have generally failed. And if and when they do, then I think we're back to Stephen Blank's world, and I agree with everything he says at that point.
Thank you very much. If anyone doesn't hear me, please just raise your hand and I'll try to speak up. So my colleagues covered a lot of ground, and I'll try to fill in some blanks and probably talk a bit both on Russia and post-Soviet countries and some also about Europe. I think just as Melinda spent the last 10 years working on democracy promotion, first with USAID on the ground and then as an academic and a researcher. And in 2012, when I was defending my PhD dissertation in Europe, I told my defense committee that there is no way Russia would allow Ukraine or Armenia freely go ahead in Eastern Partnership or sign the trade agreement. Everybody loved my dissertation, but they were like, Nelly, that's just your post-Soviet cynical mentality. We'll be fine. Russia plays by the rules, and they'll definitely join the trade agreement. Well, we know what happened in 2013. And why I'm saying this, there are reasons behind Russia's behavior like this. And among the reasons behind Russia's recent actions have been Kremlin's perception that US and EU policies in its neighborhood undermine its position in the world, and especially in its neighborhood. And democratization of anyone around Russia actually threatens current regime. At the same time, it is my opinion that the US and especially Europeans inadvertently succumbed to complacency after Cold War. And it expected Russia to play by the Western rules and by the post-Cold War rules. And hence we have the surprise among many of my European and American colleagues of Crimea's annexation. But as long as Putin considers EU and US policies threatening to its regime, the Kremlin will be a spoiler. No matter how many times we say that we do not plan to orchestrate a regime change in Russia. That's why, while there was surprise and caution here and in Europe after November elections, the mood in Russia was rather cheerful. For those of you who haven't followed Moscow's celebrations of the elections, they had several parties with pictures of President Trump, President Putin, and Marine Le Pen as the new faces of the international order. But also many of the post-Soviet leaders were very positive about Mr. Trump's election. And there are different reasons for this positive mood. And besides the usual claims that Russia tries to undermine international order. And the reasons I'm going to mention are based on surveys and also my conversations with diplomats in DC and officials and experts in the countries in between Europe and Russia. Well, on the societal level, very trivially, number one reason for preferring Mr. Trump is that he was a white male candidate, and that's supported by surveys. The presence of Russian media, which was constantly praising Mr. Trump and demonizing President Obama and Secretary Clinton. And Russian media in post-Soviet countries is not the same as RT here. Well, nobody, and I agree, watches really RT. It's really marginal. Russian media is pervasive in post-Soviet countries, especially because pretty much everyone speaks Russian, and their programming is much better quality than the local programming. On the leadership level, there's a hunch that Trump administration would not be as critical on democratization and not as critical to human rights violations as Secretary Clinton would have been. And as we know, most of these countries are not role models of democracy. At the same time, many have expressed hope that the US would actually get more involved and help them more with their pressing issues. Now this is where it gets tricky. The new administration doesn't rush to help the world, quite the opposite. And Adrian asked us what should be done. So yes, there should be a change to the US and European policy towards these countries and towards especially those Eastern Partnership countries that have been trying hard to comply with the rules and develop economically and politically. And there should be consistency in clear communication and also smart conditionality, especially from the European side. But what we had so far was uncertainty, again, especially from the side of the EU, and that uncertainty played into Russia's hand. And this has nothing to do, of course, being more involved in these countries has nothing to against the America First policy, but it actually talks about more defending the principles that the US has been championing all these times, and it talks about being to not alienate our allies. But of course, diminished US involvement can also translate into more opportunities for power grab by Russia and also China. However, as much as we like to say that there should be change or there should be more involved, we again have to have a reality check. And the reality check is that given on current administration's rhetoric, it is unlikely to get involved. And actually, I do not think that this region will be even on Mr. Trump's radar. So, and if we follow what the rhetoric has been so far, I don't think there will be a reset, but probably a restrained engagement, and that may even work. So it's likely we will dial down on language that is critical of Russia and try to cooperate to some extent on counterterrorism or other issues. But I do not see any active involvement of Russia or of the US in these countries in between Russia and Europe, or giving them any military support or cooperation. But let me maybe conclude on a bit of a positive note, and to all the doom and gloom that we have portrayed here. And Adrian also asked me to talk about a bit about Europe and also Germany. I think Mr. Trump's election has been an important wake-up call for Europeans, in the sense that Europe finally understands that it has to take its own affairs and its own security seriously, and more seriously than it has done so far, and rely less on the US. And it seems that many countries, especially Germany, has taken note, and even such German officials as Sigmar Gabriel, who is the vice chancellor, also mentioned that we have to invest more in security, in digitalization, in our partners in Europe, and also reach out to ASEAN, China, and India, as long as the US tries to go ahead with protectionist policies. So, just to and then end up with a positive note, I think there is kind of a dysfunction between the transatlantic allies. They seem to be a disarray, but at the same time, it seems that Europeans are finally getting their act together.
Well, as Chris did, I would like to go through one round of questions or follow-ups on the points made by our four panelists before opening it to the general audience, but we will have plenty of time for discussion. And forgive me if I do an injustice to my very brief summation of the question, what is to, my understanding of the four different points made about what is to be done, what should be done in the next administration. If I understand, and you'll have a chance to respond, of course, but the main takeaway, as I understood it from Stephen, from your presentation, is that given that Russia is systematically at war with us, we should be far more systematic in counter warfare. It's not a kinetic war, as you said, at least not yet, but we should respond on all fronts on which we're being attacked. Melinda, if I understand it, your prescription for the new administration, or for the future, whether or not the Trump administration is willing to listen, would be that we should reform and re-energize our support of democracy, at least in selected places and in selected ways, like the National Endowment for Democracy as a vehicle, as opposed to, let's say, a USAID mission in every country. Mitchell, I couldn't agree with you more that our policy recommendations as a panel or as an institution, as a think tank, should be based on the administration that we have, not the one that we would like to have, of course. But what is the main takeaway? If I understood, and please correct the record if I'm wrong, yes, we should do deals with Russia, deals that will inevitably be asymmetrical because they have so much more to gain and we have relatively little to gain. I may be doing you injustice, but that's what I seem to weigh in that. No, later. And then, but the one big takeaway, or one big thing that we would get in return if we did start doing deals with Russia, would be the one very specific major thing that you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, a major reduction in nuclear arms. That would be a big plus from our point of view, in your balance. Nelly, I'm not sure what the main takeaway would be, except that you are optimistic that something can be done. But my energies were flagging, so I didn't make a proper note of your main takeaway. So I'll just ask you to say what should be done differently by the next administration, if anything, or what should be done with great emphasis on what should be done if it's more continuity and difference. Let me just, for fairness sake, because you all covered a lot of ground and under very tight restraint, you all respected the 7-minute rule beautifully, and thank you. And please forgive my misunderstandings to the degree I distorted or oversimplified your, and let's go in the same order in which we started. Steve?
I didn't hear what you just said.
We're going in the same order, and either agree or disagree that the main takeaway as to what the policies of the next administration should be. is that we should fight back systematically against the war that they are waging on us on all the fronts that you mentioned.
I agree it should be more systematic. I mean, I'm pessimistic it will be.
No, it's not a question of prediction. What should be done?
What should be done? I agree it should be more as you said, it should be a systematic strategy utilizing all the instruments of power, what the military calls the dime, diplomacy, information, military, and economics, to counter the threat. And the threat is in Europe and to a somewhat lesser degree perhaps in the Middle East, if you look at the implications of what Russia's up to in the Middle East. And even to some degree in Asia, where we have Russia and China coming close to something more than a strategic partnership, and Russia certainly defending North Korea's proliferation. So I do believe that there needs to be a systematic and strategic approach to the problem of Russia. What will be, I mean, and as I said, I'm pessimistic there will be, because Mr. Trump contradicted himself in tweets. Last month he said, last month, or last week rather, he said there should be nuclear cuts in conjunction with some other deals. But the month before that, he said there ought to be an expansion and strengthening of the nuclear program. To quote Stalin,
critique the.
Yeah, but to quote Stalin, one does not joke about the American nuclear program.
We're here to recommend what should be done.
Okay.
Melinda, I probably did you an injustice, but please, what should be done?
You know, one of the questions you asked this panel was what assumptions and strategic values should these new policies be based on? And I wanted to make a vigorous case for a values-based promotion in foreign policy. We need to stay consistent with what we've done for the last 35 years. I think that Mitchell is absolutely right, though. He said it perfectly. Russia wants more from us than we want from them. This is a big problem. So, I mean, there's a number of you know, Stephen has outlined the threat on a number of different fronts. We have to think through all of these different fronts, but just in terms of what the policy should look like, we should not move away from this bipartisan, values-based foreign policy that we've hewed to for the last, since Carter. So that's the case that I wanted to make. If I could ask one question, Adrian, I would be curious to know what our panel thinks about how do you get the Russians out of the Donbass? If we can eventually go to that question, I'd be grateful.
I thought you were going to be the expert talking about. No, I'm teasing.
I'm a journalist, so I like to ask the questions.
Good, Mitchell. Please do yourself justice. I did you an injustice.
No. I think you got it mostly right. I'm saying that given that we are going to have a reset, that the thing that the United States policymakers need to look at is what are we going to get in exchange for all these things we can give to Russia, right? And I think that Trump was right to put on the table nuclear reductions, substantial nuclear reductions. Russia was kind of not that happy about that, understandably. So that's a good sign, right? That's something obviously we can get. We can ask for anyway. Another thing, though, that I was saying is that like Stephen, I think I'm arguing that Europe is ultimately more strategic for us than the Middle East for a variety of reasons, which we can get into. And therefore, our previous history of trading off security interests of ours in Europe in exchange for ephemeral gains in the Middle East is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. And if we learn anything from the previous resets, it's that we should actually be going in the opposite direction and trying to bolster our security interests in Europe, possibly at the expense of some more cooperation with Russia in the Middle East. And thirdly, that there is a possibility of cooperation in energy with Russia. That there is a possibility of doing that simply because Russia has moved away from a unidimensional attempt to monopolize flows into Europe, okay? Because gas prices collapsed and they were struggling to kind of figure out how to deal with that. The way they're doing that is reaching out to all the partners. Everybody who has gas resources has had a sort of initiative from Russia on their table. And one way to respond to that is a kind of containment sort of approach. Another way is to sort of to find ways to do those deals with them so that we don't end up in zero-sum confrontations about energy resources in different places. For instance, Libya or other places.
Right. Let me depart from my neutral chairman role for 1 second and say that in addition to the nuclear takeaway or possibly some kind of mutually accommodating deal on energy, the logic of what you've said it would be that we would insist on a return to the boundaries of Europe that were agreed under the Helsinki Agreement.
Right.
I mean, to give away that principle, since you make the point that European security and a transatlantic relationship are very important to our well-being as a nation, then a logical thing is you can't do new Ukraines. You can't use the salami tactics that I mentioned, territorial salami tactics or other. Nobody's addressed the question of interfering in domestic politics in as blatant a way, but let me, again, ask you to do the injustice that I did you in summarizing your main takeaway about what should be done, either differently or with greater emphasis.
To be specific, what should be done, and again, maybe not a reset, but a restrained engagement, which would mean keeping the sanctions as long as Russia behaves the way it behaves, because lifting sanctions now would just simply diminish US credibility, not only to Russia, but to anyone else. Perhaps open up a presidential dialogue, because for Putin, his prestige, as we also found out in the last panel, is important. So at least give the impression that we do care what Kremlin thinks, and especially when it comes to the countries of the neighborhood. Stand by NATO and by our treaties. And yes, I agree with Millie that continue democracy promotion also in post-Soviet countries, but perhaps not always call it a democracy promotion, because that is not always welcome also by the locals. Because that usually means that those who are in power in these countries, in case there is a democracy, they will be out very soon. So.
Right. Well, let me thank you very much, Nelly, and you did infinitely better justice than I could have to your takeaway conclusions or policy recommendations. Before I ask for general questions, I would like to ask for one or two volunteers from the energy panel to engage in a brief dialogue with Mitchell on the question of, is there a deal to be had on the energy level? Because the Russians need a high energy price. One of the comparative advantages of the United States, as I understand, is that we have low energy prices and abundant supplies. So it's not in our interest. At what midpoint or what kind of a deal would be mutually advantageous so that it wouldn't simply be a unilateral giveaway, even if we could control prices at a level which was attractive to the Russian budget or to the Russian balance of payments. So any comments? Is there somebody who volunteer? Yeah, but you'd have to speak at the microphone. Or do we have a movable one? It's in the middle, in the back. Sorry about the long walk. You might have to raise it.
So Garland height here. Okay. So with respect to oil, the situation is that our oil producers are private companies that respond to oil prices in financial markets. And I don't think that there is an active deal to be done per se. It's not a national oil company. As for where the U.S. stands, I think we're relatively agnostic. I mean, we're still a major net importer of oil, which we were earlier, so our aggregate interest is still in lower oil prices. But we have a very dynamic oil sector. It's now gone through a recession, gotten very beaten up. So we have an interest in reviving the shale sector, which has already begun. So I'm not sure that there is kind of an active deal to be done with the Russians, but I also don't think that the U.S. is particularly opposed at this juncture. Certainly my hedge funds clients aren't opposed to, at this juncture, just letting this OPEC deal play out and draining off the excess inventories. So there's no particular push right now to depress oil prices from that point of view. I think that there's an interest right now in the U.S. kind of, getting its breath and moving forward. So I think that OPEC interests and Russian interests and U.S. interests are, if not aligned, at least the U.S. is agnostic about it. For natural gas, I'm not sure. That's a little bit more complicated because that's so much of a regional play. That comes down really to the development of LNG and the role of LNG in balancing European markets. I don't know if Anna's here because she could speak to that. But there again, these are private companies with very long-term projects. If you look at the projects coming on, Ixtis and Wheatstone, and there are a bunch of them, these are multi-billion-dollar projects that take many, many years to come to fruition. So it's not as though it's easy to slow these down. There are also a lot of them in third countries like Australia or Indonesia. So I'm not really sure that there's that much of a deal on that part, but I'll defer to Anna on the natural gas otherwise.
So if I understand correctly, though, it would be mutually advantageous to the Russians and to us to let OPEC cause the price of oil to drift upward somewhat.
Right, and that's already happened. So I mean, the OPEC deal, the OPEC deal right now is worth probably $10 to $12 already. So we still have inventory build as of yesterday. It still wasn't looking that great. Hopefully these OPEC cuts start running through, because before the cuts, right, everybody ships everything they can. You know, oh, December 31st is a cutoff, so December 28th, everybody's loading ships as fast as they can. And those cuts aren't apparent yet in the market, certainly not in the Atlantic basin. In the Pacific basin, the inventories seem to be clearing faster. But we should start seeing, in theory, if these OPEC cuts hold up, and we think they will, we should see the market start to rebalance in the next two to 4 weeks as we run off. I don't think that there's a lot of disagreement right now. The U.S. is willing to let its oil sector get back to its feet after being on its knees for 2 years. So I don't think anybody's going to block the deal today.
Okay, thank you very much. So questions, and please line up at the, yes, is there an administrative, or is it a substantive one? Either way, you're number one, Maya.
All right. I'm about to ask one of those dreaded comment questions, so I apologize in advance. I want to come back to the title of this panel, which is Sphere of Influence Politics, and I want to talk about one of the most important players in this tug of war between Europe and Russia, and that's NATO. I'm not even going to ask a question about the possibilities or feasibility of NATO enlargement. Right now, what we see is that NATO as an institution is being questioned. I cannot overstate how important even the idea of NATO is to countries who are not members of NATO and who are Russia's neighbors. We've talked a lot about in the past whether or not Georgia should join NATO. Again, I'm not even asking about enlargement. The question of Article 5 is so big, and again, it's constantly challenged, what it means and what it should mean. So my question to all of you is, can you comment on how important it is going to be for the United States and for Western Europe to continue to build up NATO, to invest in NATO's strength, and also to invest in NATO's enhanced presence in its eastern countries? Thank you.
Okay, let me ask you for quick, short answers for NATO. To Maya's question, should we build up NATO?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. In my view, it is of the utmost importance that we continue to enhance NATO's capability and presence, first of all, in the membership countries, to thwart the threat of invasion and of nuclear blackmail that the Russians are trying to practice along the frontier from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Second, I think it's of the utmost importance as well as to keep the door open to those states that qualify and want to join, and that NATO assist them in building up its capabilities. Because although the Russians are screaming bloody murder about NATO enlargement and that NATO's a threat and so forth, they know full well NATO is no threat to anybody. And what's more, that until the Russians invaded Ukraine, the western frontier of Russia was the most peaceful of its 3 frontiers, the north being an ocean. Mr. Putin's regime cannot survive without the threat of enemies and wars. Or to quote Catherine the Great, the only way I can defend my borders is to expand them. He has said something relatively similar, although not nearly as pithy. NATO is therefore essential to preserve peace in Europe, and that means peace in Russia as well.
We're going to have to ask for shorter answers and shorter questions. We have 5-7 minutes on the clock. We can go over by 3 or 4. We only have 10 minutes total. So does anybody else have a dissenting view on NATO or a different view?
Do you mind if I have 1 minute?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so I agree with Stephen, and I'm heartened by the things that Mattis has said about NATO. The other pieces that I would put, though, on the laundry list of what this administration should do, I'm not convinced. The previous panel talked a lot about sanctions and that it has a big impact on the Russian economy. I'm personally not convinced that Russia makes its foreign policy decisions based on economics. So that might be something to talk about. I would say also the U.S. should be pushing very hard on reform in Ukraine. It should be stepping up its efforts to coordinate with the EU on Russian interference. We're getting better at this, and that's something to watch. If I were Trump's advisor, I would tell him to pick up the phone, call Putin and say, you can't interfere in U.S. elections or there will be real consequences. We will freeze your bank accounts. We will do things that that will get your attention. And I would also say that in the countries where Russia has interfered, they've given money to Le Pen's party. They've been involved in funding different organizations in Germany and Britain. We need greater transparency as well.
Any different, on the NATO question specifically, any further comments? Okay, please, brief questions, please, because we are short on time.
Ben Pributok. This probably resonates more with comments by Stephen and Melinda in terms of what is to be done. And I wanted to ask about the plausibility and the need for a coherent media, and especially a coherent social media strategy. What would the institutional requirements be? I know that there are legal obstacles. We could maybe, if we have time, maybe talk a little bit about those legal obstacles and how they could be overcome. But it seems to me, it also resonates with something that General Michael Hayden, a theme that he repeats frequently about what he calls the deep struggle, and I think it has ramifications and significance that go far beyond the counterterrorism realm. We don't do very good at this deep struggle. We don't do very well at this war of ideas. I think it's an area where Mr. Putin is vulnerable, but we're playing a very defensive game, and I'm wondering, again, what are the institutional requirements? What are the legal requirements? And also, what are the institutional requirements going forward, given a regime, given a president, an administration here that may not embrace this? You know, are there vehicles in the private sector, in the non-governmental sector, that can embrace this?
Who wants to? Anybody else want to speak to this question? Okay, you have it, Stephen.
In the interest of time, private sector is not capable of forming a unified national strategy. I think that's clear by definition because there's too many private interests and there's no coordinating body. So what I think needs to be done has to take place at the public level, that is at the governmental level. There needs to be a strategy developed and funding brought to that strategy to revitalize Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and the recreation of something like USIA based on the kinds of programs we did during the Cold War, and telling the truth, not propaganda. That's a legal issue. And an information strategy has to avoid propaganda or alternative facts. And it has to tell the truth, and it has to be capable of reaching Russian-speaking audiences and overcoming the blockages, technological blockages as well as others that Putin is throwing up in their way. You could use satellite technology. You need to have more programs of this sort and programs that entertain as well as inform, if you talk to people who listened to Radio Free Europe back in the day. And that's what needs to be done, and it needs to be done on a strategic basis. There's right now in Washington no strategy, no funding, and no understanding that information is not propaganda. And until those three obstacles are overcome, we're not going to get there. And it's not going to happen on the private sector level.
So it is changing. The State Department has something called the Global Engagement Center, and one of the goals is to be countering Russian propaganda. So we'll see how it plays out in the Obama administration. It's too hard to answer, or we'll see how it plays out in the Trump administration. It's too hard to answer now because.
But you're implying things should be done actively and perhaps differently.
Absolutely, and the EU as well has gotten involved in this issue, and they are watching and pushing back. In Ukraine, there's a great website called stopfake.org. It's journalists who are actively watching all of the stories and pushing back There needs to be more investigative journalism. We need more, not less.
Did you have a comment?
I just wanted to mention the EU initiative, the so-called EU Mythbusters, that are actually taking all the programming and or disinformation that is coming from Russia, but they need to expand. They so far work mostly in the European countries, but they also need to expand to the sort of Russia's neighborhood.
Next question, please.
Very brief comment first. Our nuclear capability has been deteriorating. I suspect the Soviets also has been deteriorating. Certainly the submarine fleet has been deteriorating. Just a statement. Second, NATO really never played much of a part during the Cold War. I played chicken at the sea with the Russians during that time. It was the United States. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to ask about a quick question, and that has to do with the Middle East. Russia is in bed with Iran. Russia's playing footsies with OPEC. And Russia has excellent relations with Israel. So could you try to answer exactly what Russia's role is? Are they trying to be a big fish in a little pond? Exactly what are they trying to do? And how trustworthy are their relationships with any of these three players? And are they trying to moderate Iran by what they're doing? So what is Putin's goal, for lack of a better word, in that area of the world?
It's a big question, good for a whole new conference. But anybody have a quick answer to that? Mitchell, you have your hand up first.
I think Steve and I should probably say something. But I'd be interested to see what Steve says first. So why don't you go?
Chicken.
Okay, I understand this game. Russia wants to achieve a status in the Middle East comparable to what it had in the 1970s, when it was competing with the United States for eminence and influence throughout the region. It wants to achieve that status so that it will have a principal voice, like it thinks we do, in determining what goes on in the Middle East and what can be done and should be done. It is not interested in stability. It is interested more in status. The best line I ever heard about Russian foreign policy was by Bob Legvold. Russia wants status, not responsibility. It's true in the Middle East as well. They also want to create a bloc of states that is pro-Russian. Happens to be the same three states that were the rejectionist front in 1978-79, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. It also is, I think, no coincidence, they're all Shiite states. It would like to, therefore, become a player in all the conflicts in the Middle East and minimize Europe and America's ability to influence the Middle East and gain access. You can see the bases they're building all over the Middle East or trying to get. And they want to use their military capabilities and presence to leverage OPEC into giving Russia a hand and some leverage on particularly LNG gas contracts going to Europe so they can influence European security. If I had more time, I could go into more detail.
And we can do that at the break privately. Mitchell?
And I would just, I guess I more or less agree, but I would emphasize that latter point more importantly than the others. You know, I think what I see happening is that Russia is, what it's really trying to do right now is it's trying to have a hand in all the energy deals in the Middle East. And the reason is it's a corollary of its strategy in Eurasia, which is in Eurasia it wants to prevent alternative suppliers from supplying to Europe. In the Middle East it can't totally prevent that, but what it wants is it wants to have a hand in the game. And so not only are they making agreements with OPEC, they're also making, they just announced another $2 billion deal with the UAE, I believe, State Sovereign Wealth Fund, just came out today. You know, so they're making deals with everybody, whether they're our allies or whether they're their allies or whether they're a bloc or not a bloc. They're also incidentally trying to intervene in Libya right now, which is not, I don't know, I mean, you know, that's a whole other scenario. So I really think that their strategy is much more driven by their oil business right now and their business interests than it is by these other things, although I agree that they are important. So I would just put primacy on that.
Remember, we're going to get the definitive word on all these questions in just 15 minutes from former Ambassador James Collins, Ambassador to Moscow. So let's be very quick. We have 2 minutes.
A very quick question to Steve. You raised the question about Radio Free Europe, which opens up a whole unfortunately, Pandora's box. Radio Free Europe, from what I understand from Rachel Maddow last night, was taken over by two 27-year-old propaganda people of Trump. Number two is the whole 7th floor of what I understand of the Foreign Department has resigned. Number three, right today, Trump is imposing a 20% tax on imports from Mexico to pay for the wall. Is not our real, I hate to be enemy, the enemy from within?
It's not what this conference is about.
I understand that, but we have to face reality, and it's maybe a Kissinger question, but I think that was what I have to ask.
Any very quick comments, please? Melinda?
The first part is not accurate. There's a Politico story that says that the Trump administration sent two people who are much younger than me, and I'm pretty young, over to VOA to sniff things out. People are concerned that the Trump administration may begin to interfere in international broadcasting, but it hasn't happened yet. So let's keep our eye on it. It's definitely something that I'm personally worried about and watching.
I'm more concerned about the 7th floor being told to resign. They didn't just resign. I mean, those people don't just resign. Look, what Mr. Trump is likely to do is very frightening to me. And by the way, he can impose all the taxes he wants on his tweet, but we still have a Congress that has to do that.
Yeah.
And they haven't, and I don't think they're going to do that, because that would be a disaster. And it would throw lots of people out of work here.
Last question.
Hi. This question is for Professor Ornstein. Quick question. I believe, if I understand correctly, you said Russia was a declining power. My question is, to my understanding, from December 25th, 1991 to the Krutitsia period in the 90s, Russia would be categorized as declining. Given the past 10 years or so, I've understood that Russia's economy is booming, unemployment levels are low, and the foreign currency reserves are among the highest in the world. With that being said, and their nuclear arsenal, why would you categorize them as declining?
Well, it is kind of tough, but essentially they did have this huge catastrophic period of decline during the 1990s that was really unbelievable, right? Especially in life expectancy going down to such an extent, and economic wherewithal. They lost, if you think of the Soviet Union versus Russia, lost a lot of territory, lost a lot of people, export of people. I mean, you're right that they had a boom in the 2000s. It was largely connected to $100, $140 oil. However, in more recent years, they've had a pretty stagnant economy. It's not like their population is massively growing or their economy is massively growing. I mean, so they face pretty uncertain prospects in a world of sanctions. They are potentially a fast developing economy, but they haven't achieved much of that potential, largely because of their dependence on oil and gas as exports, and their inability to create a rule of law or create more that would be a framework for more high-tech investment. They just, by the way, put in prison the head of one of the Kaspersky units. That was one of their best-known international companies, and he's put in prison for treason. That kind of heavy-handed state intervention, can wreak havoc on knowledge industries. So there's a lot of reasons for it, but I mean, at this point, I don't think we can presume that they're increasing in power. I mean, under Putin, they obviously did to some extent, but generally speaking, over the last 20 years, they've become much less of a factor in world affairs.
With all due respect to the rest of the panel, I won't ask for further comments on these questions for now. We're going to take, before I thank the panel, I want to make an administrative point. We're going to take a very brief 10-minute maximum break. So make a beeline for the coffee or the bathrooms or whatever as soon as we finish, and let us thank the panel for a very stimulating discussion. I would particularly ask I'd ask people to please come forward to the forward half of the room, and I'd particularly ask the speakers from the two panels to position yourselves closer so that you hear every word and are prepared to respond as to whether you agree or disagree with what I refer to as the definitive word about U.S.-Russia relations, Eurasia, the whole set of issues that we've been discussing. As I've emphasized throughout the conference, this is not about guesswork about what Trump or Mattis or Tillerson are inclined to do or likely to try to do. This is about what should be U.S. foreign policy and the understanding of these extraordinarily important events, not only for the next month, year, but for the next decade and beyond. That's, as I said earlier, the reason for existence of think tanks like these and universities like the excellent relationship. And by the way, I want to recognize Bill Burke White, head of the Perry World House, the University of Pennsylvania, with which we've had a very fruitful partnership. This is a great city, and we're very glad to have to be such a fine representative of the American public service, the American foreign service, American patriotism, as James Collins, long-term former Foreign Service colleague of mine, a man who I worked with a little bit on flying over to Europe and creating the G24 to support democratic reforms and market reforms in Europe. I will not go on because you have the bio. We have limited time. Jim has said that he'd keep his remarks to approximately 20 minutes to leave plenty of time for discussion. I do want to emphasize, first of all, you should all know that this is all being webcast and will be available on the FPRI website. Maya, is that going to be tomorrow or Monday?
Right now.
Right now.
People are watching you.
I know that's live cast, but I'm talking about if you miss any of these pearls of wisdom, then you can go back to the FPRI website a few days from now. It doesn't take, there's not a further upload delay. I didn't realize that. I misunderstood. Jim, all yours.
Thank you very much. Adrian, thank you. And I want to thank the two panels. It's always hard to come after panels like that because everything's been said and, it's just not everybody's said it. So I'm going to try to approach this in a rather different way, perhaps, from what the panels were doing, by saying that my own view is that the most critical need at the moment in U.S.-Russia relations, no matter what the details, is that the United States has to define its strategic objectives and its strategic purpose in a new relationship with Russia. Now, I think, we're 25 years after the end of the Soviet Union, a little more after the end of the Cold War. And we had a certain approach to how the future of the Euro-Atlantic security system would develop, to how we were going to work with the new realities of an ended empire, new states. I was very popular because I created 14 ambassadorships when I got rid of the Soviet Union. How is all this going to come together? And people don't quite focus on the fact that at that time, there was great turmoil in the thinking of Europeans, former Soviet citizens, Americans, about what was the kind of future we would build. Was NATO going to survive? How would the new states in the East have a relationship with all of these traditional European institutions? Nobody really had that sorted out. And so when we essentially took the lead in deciding that the model was going to be integration, that is, open to all to join, in essence, the European project, if you can call it that, and NATO, this was a very major decision. And it essentially is the one that has guided our approaches to the Russian experience since, to all of the states around Russia since, and to what was then East Europe and then traditional Western Europe. And that strategy was really quite simple, that NATO and the EU, or something very close to that, was just going to keep getting bigger. And the problem we have come up against over the last 20 years or so is that some people agreed with that and some didn't. And the people who basically, in the end, have not accepted it were those, first and foremost, in Moscow, but some others in the East. And our problem has been that we more or less carried that strategy up to the point where we are now, where you have an enlarged NATO, an enlarged European Union, you have a netherworld in between Moscow and its region, and nobody's quite sure just where we go next. And I think that if you ask, what's the challenge that this administration or this country now faces, is what kind of idea are we going to have about the next stage, and what's the strategy going to be to pursue it? And I think this is a very profound moment, frankly, because I think it's pretty clear to everybody that who's kind of run the string on the last system, but nobody's quite come up with the next idea. So I don't want to talk about a reset anymore. I want to talk about the question of how do we find the way to reach a new premise, if you will, for the future of Euro-Atlantic security writ large between the United States and our allies and those people to the east, but most specifically Russia, which is very uncomfortable about the idea and has now rejected integration as a premise. So that's our challenge. And I guess in that sense, I wanted to give a few thoughts about considerations I would put in front of Mr. Tillerson and Mr. Trump and so forth if I were to be asked, which I won't be. The first would be that you need a strategy, and you need to develop policies and tactics that will support advancing the goals of that strategy. And I would simply submit to you that for several years now, if not a decade, we've been good at tactics, or we've basically relied on tactics, and we haven't had much of a strategy. Now, when we begin this process, I have to say I don't envy the people who are responsible, because the challenge of Russia now, which is presenting itself as an alternative to us, an alternative model for development, an alternative idea, is pretty formidable. And we do not face very good conditions in which to begin to make decisions. The relations with Russia are the worst they've been since the Cold War. There's no question of that. We just aren't talking to one another. And we are, whether we want to say we're at war with one another or not, I don't find that very useful. We are in an adversarial relationship. And everybody understands that's what it is. And nobody's got any much idea about where we go from here. Secondly, if you look out from Washington, it's kind of a mess. The European Union seems to be rickety right now. It's not falling apart. I would agree with Professor Ornstein. I don't think it's going to fall apart, but it's rickety. It's got problems, Brexit, et cetera. NATO, too, is something, it's not in trouble, but it's a bit adrift. I mean, it's sort of good the Russians have become threatening because it's given us a place to focus. But it doesn't give an answer to the broader questions of how do you strengthen and make modern the concept of collective defense. If you look at the Middle East, we've made some progress on things like the Iran nuclear issue. But frankly, it's not looking very positive. And in fact, it's more or less out of control. Russia, meanwhile, has advanced, it's grown its influence in the Middle East. And it isn't just because of Syria. I think someone mentioned, the most remarkable change in Russia's position in the Middle East over the last 25 years is the relation with Israel. It was non-existent in 1991, and now it's really quite close. Iran is a good partner with them. Problems between them, always will be, but they are good. And the Syria adventure has given Russia credibility as a power. In Asia, Russia has accepted that it's the junior partner in the China relationship, which is a big deal for them to do. But they have swallowed it. But now they're seeking to use it, in a sense, to say, well, we collectively are the future. Asia is rising, China is the major power. We see more or less the world in similar ways. And by the way, what that means is we don't need the Americans telling us what to do or setting the agenda. They're even courting Japan to a degree. So the world doesn't look too much like it did 20 years ago, let's say, from Washington. It's a lot trickier. And our relative capacities are considerably diminished from what they were. Now, that said, things don't look so good for Moscow either. You have a Russia who has an economy that is stagnant, for all intents and purposes. We had heard a lot about energy. The problem is, for Russia, it is energy, and they don't have much else. And they have not diversified their economy or developed the capacity to grow into a modernized economic power. If you look at Ukraine, Syria, so yes, they have shown that they can tear something up, create some chaos and so forth, but they're now stuck. It's not clear where you go with Ukraine. It's not at all clear. I mean, if they've got Syria and own it, be my guest. This is my sense right now. It's very tough. The idea that they are a major Asia power, or that China is going to come to their rescue as the alternative to Europe in terms of investment and technology, is turning out not to be true. So from the Russian perspective, too, it's not a very particularly, I would say, beneficial or positive environment. And Russia is, in fact, a weak power with demographic, economic, and a variety of other challenges that really are quite severe. That gives, I would say, a certain sense of opportunity. Now, we talked a fair amount about what do we want from Russia, or what does Russia want from us, what do we want from it. I think the problem is we don't know what we want from Russia. And I have to say, I don't happen to share the idea that they have this big, long list and we have a little tiny note. I mean, we are leaders of the global system in many ways. And the problem is that in order to be an effective leader of the global system, you have to have people who will work with you, the other major powers. Whether we like it or not, Russia is a major power, as is China, Brazil, and a number of others. It's not what it was in the 1980s, but it is a major power. And we cannot advance many, many of the objectives that Americans believe are important without the Russians coming along with us. And it's simply a truism that if the Russians and Americans can cooperate, you tend to get better outcomes than when they're adversaries. So I think one shouldn't simply look at that balance as we don't have much we want and they've got this big list. It may be different in quality and in kind, but it's nevertheless an important list. So what do we know about where we are today? What we know is that both leaders have said in their particular unique styles, they want to improve relations, that relations are not what they should be and they have to be improved. They haven't given any idea about how they're going to do this. They've suggested a couple or three areas that were mentioned by the panels: nuclear reductions, economic, building the economic relationship back, and so forth. But the real question, in essence, is how are you going to get started? And on the American side, what are going to be our goals and our assumptions? So I have a couple of thoughts about some premises I would suggest ought to guide us to begin with. The first one is depersonalize all of this relationship. We are doing ourselves no good at any level by making Putin, in a sense, the personification of evil and challenge. We're dealing with Russia. It's another major state. It's not a problem. It's not a project. It's a society and a country. And it has a very complex and difficult past and history. It's got its own culture. It's got its own experience, its own geographic realities, and so forth. And those are the things that are important. I mean, Putin is certainly a leader. He's had major impact on certain decisions and the way things have gone. But the idea that if Putin would just disappear, all would be wonderful and we'd have a Jeffersonian democracy there is simply naive. It's not going to happen, and it will never happen. That does not mean that we cannot come to terms that are mutually beneficial on both sides. So my first point is, as a part of assumptions and strategies, get rid of the idea that it's Putin that's the problem. We have a challenge of redefining a relationship with another major power. And we need to think of it in those terms. Second thing I would say is, remember that history matters. And all of the things that are associated with defining how Russia has developed its worldview and how it sees the West and so forth, or other parts of the world, are not going to change overnight, and they didn't change just because in 1991 Gorbachev held on the Soviet flag and they became Americans, or saw the world we do. Russia has every good reason to be a little suspicious of the West. You know, very few good things have come to Russia from the West, from their perspective, if they're in the sweep of history or the historical perspective. I mean, it's everything from communism to World War II. And these are deeply ingrained in the history. They have a very different idea from us about revolution. You know, we think revolution is basically a good thing. It gave birth to our country as a process. For the Russians, basically it's chaos and it gave them the Bolsheviks. And they're not terribly pleased, and they're very leery of that. So the key point I would make here is it isn't just tangible interests. It's not just economics or energy or even hard security issues that you have to remember in dealing with this society. You got to understand that a lot of psychology, a lot of good diplomacy, and a lot of understanding about what they think is important is well beyond just the tangible interests. So begin to understand that they think they were humiliated at the end of the Soviet period and since. They are feeling very denigrated. Now, I don't know what you do with that, but I would simply say there's nothing wrong with giving them the respect, treating them like another major power. And if we would do that, I think we would all be better off. So you don't say, frankly, as President Obama did, that it's a second-rate regional power. I mean, this simply creates problems. So depersonalize it, treat them as another major power. Then you can begin to get down to some of the other things that I think are then essential. And I don't want to go on too long. But here are two or three things I would commend to the leadership. The first is before we do anything with Russia, before, God knows, before any summits, get our own act together. Decide what our goals are. Try to build a new vocabulary about what you're after with Russia, and try to get consensus in this country, with the Congress, with the public, in the media to the extent you can do it, about what we're trying to do and how we see the future of this relationship. If we don't have that, we go into any negotiation weakened. It's that simple. And so we need bipartisan support, and we need the kind of, if you will, capacity to speak with one voice that right now is almost unimaginable. But this is going to be a challenge for the new president, frankly. Second thing I would say is if you can get that, or at least once you've got started on that, you then got to husband our assets. And I would submit that those fundamentally mean you've got to go out and talk with our allies, with the NATO people, with the EU, with Japan, with those countries where we basically share the objective of developing our societies in ways that we have in common, or where basically we share the future. It's different from what the Russians have got in mind and many other parts of the world. But our assets are our allies. They are a force multiplier in all ways. I don't care, not just tangibly, if it's a few tanks in the Baltics. They are essentially, make us not just 350, but 850 people, 1 million people. That's a very important point, and it's not missed on Mr. Putin, I can assure you. So get our assets together and pull them together. Now that means, frankly, I would do what I did when I was working with Jim Baker. On his first week, we went to every NATO capital, and he talked to the people. It makes a difference. We're in this together. That's the message that needs to go out. I won't comment on whether it's going to go or not, but I mean, it's what needs to do. If Mr. Tillerson doesn't have anything else to do, he could get on a plane and visit every NATO capital in the next 2 weeks. It would be a very useful exercise. So get the assets together is really the next major part. Then I think it's very important for us all, for the group, to sit down and make a very realistic assessment of just where are relations and where have they been and where can they go. Now here, I think it's important to realize that ever since the 80s, really, or the Gorbachev period, we've been on a roller coaster. It goes up, we reset it, then we go down because people don't like it, go up again, down again, up. We need to stop that cycle, is my view, and we need to try to put a foundation in place where we can begin a steady improvement built on a solid foundation. That means it's not terribly sexy, it doesn't have a nice, simple term, but it says we're going to start a new kind of action to build a relationship that has substance behind it and that makes sense. So there are a few areas in which I think you begin, but the first thing I would say is understand that right now we see each other as adversaries. I don't like the word enemies, and I don't like Cold War, but we see each other as adversaries. And there is a whole long list of complaints on both sides. You're not going to get rid of that in one meeting, and I'm very dubious of any grand bargains. But what I do think is that we have a certain small foundation to build on, and we need now to start very clearly to say, all right, if we're going to improve these relations as we both want, let's start on very practical things. Where I would start would be on military to military issues. We're already doing it in Syria, where we don't run into each other in airplanes. Well, right. But it's minimal, and it needs to be enhanced. So military to military context to prevent incidents or things that could escalate. There are lots of agreements there. They're just not being implemented, or they're not being used. Second would be to encourage the political leadership of both countries to say to their military leaders, you guys start to talk, and you figure out what it is that we need to be sure we don't get into trouble about, or how we can make some progress. Thirdly, I think if you can get this far, then I think one ought to begin to raise the question of further nuclear reductions, possibly. What do we do about proliferation of nuclear weapons, nuclear terrorism, this kind of thing. It's certainly tangible, and it's certainly possible to talk about. And finally, if we do get there, you go after some kind of general strategic stability discussions and so on, that open up a much bigger set of questions. But my point here is start small and start practical. Because if you can do that, you can then build to the next step and you get some trust. Second thing I would say it makes sense to begin talking about is Middle East. My view is here, we better decide what we want in the Middle East. Because, frankly, I don't think we're going to get involved in the Syria conflict. At least I hope not. The Russians more or less own it. And therefore, the question now is, how are we going to prevent the refugee issue from becoming worse? How can we deal with that? How can we prevent Syria from becoming more destabilizing to the region? How can you perhaps bring something to encourage a de-escalation and a longer-term solution? We've got a dialogue that has existed. They can pick up on it, and I would support that. What I would suggest, however, that Mr. Trump ought to be very careful not to buy Syria as an American problem, because the Russians have created the problem in many ways, and now they're going to have to live with it. But I think, we have certain Middle East equities that we do share and that are a basis for some cooperation. One is the Iran agreement, which I hope is going to survive. A second one is the fact that we both have terrorism problems. And the third is that we don't want to see Syria, frankly, disintegrate or fall into the hands of crazies or otherwise destabilize the area. I mean, I don't happen to think Russians see a chaotic Middle East as in their interest. I don't believe they do. I think they're very scared of it. And finally, there's Ukraine. I don't have a simple answer on Ukraine, but we're going to have to deal with the issue of that I started with. Ukraine is, in some sense, the symbol of a failure to come to terms with how we're going to deal with the fact that Russia is not prepared to buy into integration, and we were pursuing the idea that that's the only thing there is. And Ukraine's the meat in the sandwich. Now, there's no simple answer to Ukraine, but my own view is it would be to make clear to Mr. Putin that we totally support Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, that we expect Russia and Ukraine to normalize their relations and come to terms that will stabilize their borders and return Ukraine to sovereignty and protect its independence. And they're going to have to sort out the question, frankly, in my view, of Crimea and a lot of other issues that have never been sorted out between Russians and Ukrainians in the last 25 years. For Ukraine, that means they need a good base of support from us. They need to understand that we will not abandon them. But it also means that they have to pull their act together and come to terms with their neighbors. Now, that's not going to be simple, and it's not going to be easy. But it means, essentially, that we have to leave Mr. Putin in no doubt that nothing good will happen in his sanctions questions or his economic cooperation or other kinds of things of that kind unless and until we find some resolution that is stable in Ukraine and protects their sovereignty and independence, and the same with the rest of the neighbors. And that would bring me to my last point, I think, on that. We have never really discussed, I can tell you myself, with Russia, what good relations between Russia and its neighbors would look like from our point of view. What we've basically always said is we will not tolerate the restoration of an empire. But we've never said what a good alternative is. And I know this from my time doing this, and I know that it's been true ever since. I know Russia's neighbors have a problem living with the bear. It's a big country, it's a problem. But they're not going to change geography either way. And so the question is, what is it we can do, I would say as a strategic objective, to help these countries, Russia and its neighbors, find a different approach from the hostilities and the suspicions and the troubles that they have so far experienced in the breakup of the empire? I don't know that we have an answer to that, but I think approaching it in that spirit could bring a rather different result from simply saying, we are here to prevent empire, which means, frankly, that every one of Russia's neighbors has played us off against the Russians over the last 25 years. And nobody's won from the project. So with that, let me stop here. I don't think I've told you the answers to any questions, but I hope I've given you some thought about questions that we ought to be asking ourselves. So thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So I'd like to hear from anybody.
So we're now open for questions. And,
questions, comments.
As before, you have to, and brief comments. And you need to do it at the microphone, which is in the center aisle. So whoever would like to go first should get up to the microphone, and second, and so on. Yes, please. And get close to the microphone.
Sorry?
I'm suggesting you get close to the microphone because your voice was a little soft the first time. Earlier.
There it's better.
Good, perfect.
Okay. I learned a lot from what you had to say. Thank you very much. It seems, however, that you're assuming that something about Russia, which I don't get quite, and that may be my ignorance, that they have some relationship to the truth, and that in the negotiations with them, we can trust what they say. What if their objective is our destabilization and destruction, and they want to lead us on to something, that will not be good for us?
Well, I mean, I don't assume trust at all, and I don't think you negotiate with Russia on that. Well, I think, Mr. Reagan had a very, famous quote for that, you trust but verify, which is one way. And secondly, you negotiate and you come to terms on agreements that are such that you can, if you can't enforce them, then the agreement breaks down, which may happen. But you are not basically saying, I'll live up to it even if you don't. I mean, we're dealing with another country. One of the problems we've had in the last several years is our approach has been, we're going to compel Russia to do something. And Russia's reaction to that has been, we're going to make life miserable for you by interfering in your politics and disrupting things, so that you'll see that that's not so easy to do. And we've reached a stalemate. Now, I don't think when you negotiate any agreement or you work with another side that you cannot trust, that you necessarily ever make an agreement that you can't verify. That's simply a reality. And that's where you start. And if you have then some that you can work with, you hope that you will build a modicum of trust so that the next time it's a little easier.
Good.
First of all, I'd like to say I thought your remarks were excellent. Our previous panels and the media in general remind me of the 1950s crack that when Stalin died, Congress wondered what his motive was. But in dealing with something like maintaining the sovereignty of the Ukraine, I would presume we would be better off if we could convince Putin and the American public that sovereignty would look like Finland, not like Estonia. Is that possible?
Well, look, I think there's no question that the United States is going to stand behind the principle and the premise that the states that emerged out of the Soviet system and the Russian Empire are now full members of the international community, and they are going to have we're going to stand behind their sovereignty and independence. Now, that said, I mean, I think the reality is we're going to have to find the means to resolve a couple of the elements of the Ukraine problem that are not in our control. One of them is that the Ukrainians and Russians are going to have to come to terms with one another. I personally am not in a position where I will say to Ukrainians, you cannot have any agreement but putting it back to the status quo ante. Ukrainians need to decide if that's the right thing for them. I think they should have the right to do that. And Russians have to understand that they're not going to have recognized something that is not agreed by Ukraine. So, I mean, we cannot force the Russians out of Ukraine. It's that simple. I will simply tell you, because we're not going to go to war. Nuclear weapons prevent it. But we are going to have to make sure that Ukraine is capable of defending its own interests and its own sovereignty. And that means not just militarily, but also politically and economically. And that raises the second part. Ukraine is making some progress in developing its economy and developing its political system. But frankly, they've taken 25 years to take it seriously. And unless they pull together, which they may be doing now, there isn't much way we can defend their independence and sovereignty unless they are prepared to do it. And I think that message has to be very clear to them. So that's kind of where I am on this issue.
Ron? I guess we should ask you, I think our ground rule was supposed to be, please identify yourselves. I forgot to enforce it, but please say who you are.
I'm Ron Granieri from FPRI, and I am curious, when you talk about the relationship between the United States and Russia as two great powers, and if we treat the regimes, the respective internal regimes of the two states as irrelevant, then we can argue on the basis of power and interests. But obviously, I just see you shake your head, you're with me on this, right? It is relevant what kind of regimes we're talking about. And the fact that it's one thing for the Russians to say, quite practically, that they don't like the integration model. But if the Russian regime chooses to view the European Union as a threat, not because the European Union is objectively a threat, but just because the Russian regime doesn't like to see successful, liberal, Western-oriented regimes emerge on their borders. On what basis can the United States and Russia reach an agreement about, Ukraine being a problem in itself, but even how can they reach a modus vivendi about how to deal with these states? Or is it up to the United States, which I hope not, but is it up to the United States to simply say we cannot defend these liberal regimes in the East, and in the name of better relations with Russia, we should let them all become Finland circa 1965?
No, look, I mean, I'm a veteran of the Cold War too, and for sure, we had two systems which were at proclaimed war with one another. But it didn't stop us finding the ways to set the framework for dealing with one another in a way that didn't threaten each other's security, or at least minimize the threats. And I would argue that's the real challenge. I'm not here to say we want to be all, loving friends. It's not going to happen. What we need here is some very practical arrangements that are going to protect certain basic principles. That you don't use armed force to resolve a dispute with a neighbor. That you do not use weapons of mass destruction. You try to reduce that. You try to limit the threats to safety and security across borders. Now, that's very different from saying we're all going to become one happy family. That's not what I'm suggesting. But making these arrangements, at least for the opener, or the outset, seems to me terribly important. And there was a whole history in the Cold War in which it took us quite a while to get to the point of setting down and negotiating some rules of the game. Those have evaporated, frankly. I mean, it's fine for us to go back and talk about the Helsinki principles and so forth, but remember when those were negotiated. The Soviet Union was controlling half of Europe, and the whole arrangement of the way forces and other things were structured was completely different. So new realities need not necessarily new principles, but they need new applications of those principles. And I would argue that that's what we ought to be talking with Moscow about. How are we going to protect security? How are we going to diffuse, for instance, the absurd situation in which we have nuclear strategic weapons on 20-minute warning? You know, a president is going to have 20 minutes to decide whether to start World War III. Now, that's nuts in the modern world, but that's still where we are. And you have similar issues across borders where forces are much closer together. So, I mean, it isn't that I'm suggesting we're going to, make this grand bargain. We may or we may not. But we need to deal with the security issues that are real ones and the instabilities that have arisen now from failure to find ways to resolve differences without use of force.
Am I on? I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative of just one quick comment on Ron Guarneri's question. That is that, yes, I think it was Ron, or was it Jim, who said Ukraine or the expansion of the EU does not represent a threat to Russia. That's true militarily. But to the extent that not only Putin, but many Russians see their system as a more traditionalist, more authoritarian system, the idea of and also state-controlled economy or state-dominated economy, to the extent that they see that as who they are, then having successful, vibrant, economically successful and democratically vibrant countries right next door to them is an existential threat. That's a big problem. As I see it.
But I would add one other thing. There's another tangible problem. I mean, if you're a military planner at the Moscow General Staff and you say, well, what do you do if NATO welcomes in Ukraine? What their first thought must be is that means the 1st Cavalry Division shows up on the Russian border. Now, we may think that's nuts, but that's what they have to think about. And so the question is, how do you find the means to begin to create assurances that there are ways for mutual security arrangements that do not present those threats, even when you have things like belonging to different organizations or whatever? And I think we have to remember that this is we may think they don't have reason to think that. But, American tanks are showing up in the Baltics. And the Baltics are saying, well, yeah, but the Russian tanks are right on our border. I agree. The question is, how do you get beyond the idea that that's, the testosterone quotient is what measures whether you're being secure or not?
Why don't we go to the next question?
Mr. Ambassador, you talked about that Russia is getting very good relations with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel. Now, Israel and Saudi Arabia don't get along very well with Iran. So I mean, there are some good lessons maybe to be learned here, that how should we manage or how they are able to do it. And I have another question, like it's not related to this, but looking at how Russia has been having some expansionist agenda in Crimea and China in the South China Sea, and if both of these countries keep doing this, what can we do about this to check this stance of these two countries? Thank you. Yes, this is Nihal Agaf. I'm with Ameriprise Financial.
Yeah. I don't think I said Saudi Arabia has become very close to Russia, but there is now a relationship between Moscow and Riyadh that never existed before. I mean, that is relatively new over the last several years.
But you did say Israel and Iran.
No, yes, well, their relations with Iran are much closer. Their relations with Syria are much closer. And what's interesting is the relations with Israel have become much more open. I mean, look, Russia as expansionist. We haven't, let's set Crimea aside, because Crimea is a unique case. Somewhere, somehow, Ukraine and Russia will have to sort that issue out. It was an issue from Christmas Day 1991, it was always an issue. And it never really got resolved. They were fighting over the fleet, they were fighting over this or that right, who had rights to do what. I mean, it was never really resolved. I'm not arguing whether that's right or wrong, it's just a reality. So I would say we're not going to recognize Russia's incorporation of Crimea, just like we never recognized the Soviet Union's incorporation of the Baltic states. But sooner or later, Crimea will have to be resolved between Ukraine and Russia, one way or another.
This is going to have to be the last question for administrative reasons.
But and the rest of it, in terms of eastern Ukraine, it isn't clear at all. In fact, everyone in an official position in Russia said, we do not want to incorporate eastern Ukraine. That is part of Ukraine. What they don't want is Ukraine, if you will, going west. And that's going to have to be decided by Ukrainians themselves.
One very quick last question, and then we'll have to cut it off, but Ambassador Collins will be here for a little individual conversation for a few minutes. Please go ahead quickly.
My name is Chris Tremolia, University of Pennsylvania. Ambassador, you made the comment that relations between the U.S. and Russia are as bad as they were during the Cold War.
You know, at worst, since the Cold War.
Sorry. My question would be, is how did we get there? During the 2012 presidential debates, Mitt Romney made the comment Russia was going to be our, most worried about foreign power. He laughed it off and said, we want, Mitt Romney, the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. The Obama administration is also the administration that admitted to missing the rise of ISIS. So during this time, my question is, what have they been doing during this entire time, and specifically pertaining to Russia, what were they doing?
What's who doing?
What was the Obama administration doing during all this time if they missed the growing part of Russia as a threat and ISIS as a threat?
Yeah, look, I think, to be honest, the first term of the Obama administration had a pretty clear agenda with the Russians. And they also had a president in Russia that was prepared to work, at least basically, on that agenda. And the objective of the Russian president at that time was a very different one from what Mr. Putin said his objective was when he came back. I would simply summarize it this way, that Mr. Medvedev said our objective, and this was the Obama partner in the first term, is to modernize Russia. That was the buzzword. When Mr. Putin came back, it was changed to make Russia great again, to quote. Now, that meant something very different. And the entire, when Mr. Putin came back, I guess I would say there were a couple of problems. One, The bargain he was elected on was, you let me run things and I'll make you all richer and better at life and so forth, and he couldn't deliver. It wasn't going to happen. And so he started down the path of saying, you know, that he needed support because he was the one who was going to keep Russia from being inundated or overrun by the Western heathen and so forth. And he started the, if you will, the entire anti-American campaign. Well, this is before Ukraine. He started the anti-Western campaign at home, that Russia had to, in a sense, depend on itself. It had to resist Western encirclement, Western pressures, and so forth. And this only got worse through the Ukraine events of 2014 and so forth. And it resulted in one thing getting worse after another. But there was a distinct turn when Putin came back to office from where they were in the first Obama term, when there was a fair amount of cooperation and a fair amount of joint, I would say, joint objective.
So I'm very sorry, we do have to cut it off for technical reasons, but Jim, Ambassador Collins will be here for a few more minutes, and several of our panelists are right in the front row if you want to come back and follow up on some of the issues. So thank you very, very much. Please, thank you, Jim.
Thanks very much.